The spring of 1812 had been the season of Eleanor Ashford's greatest hopes and deepest humiliation. At 20 years of age, Lady Eleanor, only daughter of the Earl of Ashford, had entered London society with modest expectations. Her father's estate in Derbyshire was respectable but not grand, her dowry adequate but not impressive. She possessed what her mother called quiet beauty, dark chestnut hair that caught auburn lights in the sun, intelligent grey eyes, and a grace of manner that came from genuine kindness rather than calculated charm. She had not expected to catch the eye of Lord James Hartley, heir to the Marquis of Pemberton, one of the most eligible gentlemen in England. Yet he had pursued her with a determination that had set tongues wagging throughout Mayfair. He had claimed the first dance at Lady Wetherby's ball, had driven her through Hyde Park in his phaeton, had engaged her in conversations about poetry and philosophy that lasted hours. He had made her believe, foolish girl that she was, that he saw something in her beyond her social position. "You have a mind, Lady Eleanor," he had told her one afternoon in the Ashfords' drawing room, his blue eyes earnest. "So many young ladies concern themselves only with fashion and gossip. You are different. You are exceptional." She had allowed herself to hope, to dream, to imagine a future as the Marchioness of Pemberton, not for the title, but because she had genuinely believed James cared for her. Then Miss Georgiana Blackwell had arrived in London. The daughter of a wealthy merchant who had purchased a baronetcy, Georgiana brought with her a dowry of £50,000 and her father's ruthless ambition to see her marry into the highest ranks of the peerage. She was beautiful in the conventional way, golden curls, china blue eyes, and a figure that drew admiring glances from every gentleman in the room. Eleanor had watched James's attention shift with the speed of a weather vane in a storm. Within a fortnight, he was dancing attendance on Miss Blackwell. Within a month, he was calling on her family daily. And then, at the Duchess of Richmond's ball, one of the grandest events of the season, James had approached Eleanor as she stood near the refreshment table. "Lady Eleanor," he had said, his tone carefully modulated to sound regretful, "I hope you will forgive my seeming inattention these past weeks. I have been much occupied with family matters." She had known what was coming, had felt it in the pitying glances from other young ladies, in the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room. "I must be honest with you," James continued, speaking just loudly enough that several nearby guests could hear. "I hold you in the highest regard, but I have come to realize that my duty to my family must take precedence over personal inclination. The Marquis requires that I make a match which will strengthen our family's position. I am sure you understand." The humiliation had burned through her like acid, not just the rejection, she might have borne that privately, but the public nature of it. The way he had essentially announced to society that she was not good enough, that her modest dowry and respectable but unremarkable family connections made her unworthy of his continued attention. "I understand perfectly, Lord Hartley," she had managed to say, her voice steady despite the mortification coursing through her. "I thank you for your honesty." She had maintained her composure through the remainder of the ball, had even danced twice more, though she could not afterward recall with whom. But when she returned home that night, she had wept until dawn. Within 6 weeks, James Hartley's engagement to Miss Georgiana Blackwell was announced in the Times. That had been 2 years ago, 2 years during which Eleanor had rebuilt herself, piece by careful piece. She had returned to London for the subsequent seasons, but now she approached society with clear eyes and a guarded heart. She conversed politely, danced when asked, and deflected questions about her matrimonial prospects with practiced grace. She had received a few offers, a baronet of middling years, a clergyman with more piety than charm, a third son seeking a wife to manage his modest household. She had declined them all. If she must marry for practical reasons rather than love, and her mother reminded her frequently that, at 22, she was rapidly approaching the dreaded status of spinster, then she would at least ensure the match provided security and respect. She had not expected a proposal from Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenscross. The Duke was a legend in English society, though not the romantic sort that inspired sighs from young ladies. At 32, he had held his title for 14 years. Since his father's death when Alexander was merely 18, he had taken a duchy on the brink of financial ruin and transformed it into one of the wealthiest estates in England through shrewd management and careful investment. He was known for his intelligence, his political influence, and his absolute refusal to suffer fools. He attended balls and social events as duty required, but remained aloof, dancing once or twice per evening and conversing only when necessary. His dark hair, striking green eyes, and tall, commanding figure made him attractive, but his cold demeanor ensured that most young ladies found him intimidating rather than appealing. Eleanor had met him only 3 times before he called upon her father. The first occasion had been at a political dinner hosted by Lord Castlereagh, where Eleanor accompanied her parents. The Duke had been seated near her father and had engaged in a brief discussion about the management of tenant farms. Eleanor had contributed an observation about crop rotation that her father's steward had mentioned, and the Duke had fixed her with those penetrating green eyes for a long moment before nodding thoughtfully. "An intelligent point, Lady Eleanor," he had said. "Your father is fortunate to have a daughter who takes interest in such practical matters." The second meeting had occurred at the theatre, where a chance arrangement of boxes had placed the Ashfords adjacent to the Duke. During the interval, he had inquired politely about Eleanor's opinion of the performance, a new production of The School for Scandal, and she had offered a critique of the lead actress's interpretation that had sparked an unexpectedly engaging conversation about Sheridan's wit and social commentary. The third meeting had been at Lady Pemberton's garden party only a week ago. Eleanor had been standing near the rose arbor, seeking a moment's respite from the crowds, when the Duke had approached. "Lady Eleanor," he had said without preamble, "I wonder if I might speak with you frankly." "Of course, Your Grace," she had replied, curious but not alarmed. "I find myself in need of a wife," he had stated, as directly as if he were discussing the weather. "I require someone intelligent, well-mannered, and capable of managing a ducal household. Someone who will not bore me with frivolous conversation or harbor romantic illusions about our arrangement. I have observed you over these past months, and I believe you possess the qualities I seek." Eleanor had stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I am aware this is unorthodox," he continued, "but I prefer directness to the usual charade of courtship. My position and wealth would provide you with security and social prominence. Your intelligence and dignity would provide me with a suitable duchess. I would expect discretion, competence, and civility. In return, I would offer respect, generous financial provision, and freedom to pursue your own interests within the bounds of propriety." "You are proposing marriage, Your Grace?" Eleanor had asked, still attempting to process this extraordinary conversation. "I am proposing a practical arrangement that would benefit us both," he had corrected. "I do not offer romantic declarations or promises of affection, but I do offer honesty and a partnership based on mutual respect." Eleanor had taken a steadying breath. Every practical consideration argued for acceptance. The Duke was wealthy, powerful, and, despite his cold manner, reportedly fair in his dealings. As his Duchess, she would have security, position, and protection. She would never again face the kind of humiliation James Hartley had inflicted upon her, and yet, some small part of her heart, the part that still remembered believing in love, hesitated. "Might I have time to consider, Your Grace?" she had asked. "Of course. I shall call upon your father in 3 days' time. You may send word before then if you wish to decline." He had paused, studying her with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "I am aware of your history with Lord Hartley, Lady Eleanor. I mention this only to assure you that I would never treat you with such disrespect. Whatever else our marriage might be, it would be honorable." That simple statement, delivered without dramatics or false sentiment, had somehow meant more than any flowery declaration could have. Eleanor had spent 2 sleepless nights considering the Duke's proposal. She had made lists of advantages and disadvantages, had consulted her mother, who nearly fainted with excitement at the prospect, and had engaged in a frank conversation with her father. "He is not offering love, Papa," she had said quietly as they sat in his study. "He is offering a business arrangement." The Earl of Ashford, a kind man who genuinely cared for his daughter's happiness, had considered carefully before responding. "That is true, my dear, but I will tell you what I have observed of the Duke. He is a man of his word. He is fair to his tenants, generous to his servants, and scrupulous in his business dealings. He does not gamble recklessly or keep mistresses openly. He is respected by his peers and feared by his enemies." He had taken her hand gently. "You will not have romance, Eleanor, But you will have security, respect, and I believe kindness. That is more than many love matches provide." Her mother had been less philosophical. "The Duke of Ravenscross. Eleanor, you would be one of the highest-ranking ladies in England. You would have jewels, gowns, a London house, country estates, and such a handsome man, even if he is rather stern." In the end, Eleanor had made her decision based on one simple realization. She no longer believed in romantic love. James Hartley had cured her of that delusion. If she must marry, and at 22 with a modest dowry, her options would only diminish. Then she would choose a marriage based on honesty rather than pretty lies. She had sent word to the Duke that she would accept his proposal. When he had called upon her father, the negotiations had been brief and businesslike. The Duke was generous in his settlement, far more generous than necessary, and made provisions that would ensure Eleanor would be financially secure even if he died. He promised that she would have her own household budget to manage as she saw fit, her own carriage and freedom to pursue charitable works and intellectual interests. "When would you prefer the wedding to take place?" the Duke had asked Eleanor directly once the contracts were signed. "I leave that to your discretion, Your Grace," she had replied. "Alexander," he had corrected. "If we are to be married, we might at least use Christian names in private. I propose we marry by special license in 3 days' time. A small ceremony, family only. I see no purpose in a protracted engagement or a grand society wedding that would subject us both to tedious scrutiny." Eleanor had agreed, grateful to avoid months of whispered speculation and pitying glances. They had married in the drawing-room of Ashford House 3 days later, with only their immediate families present. The Duke, Alexander, had been punctual, properly dressed, and formally polite. He had spoken his vows in a clear, firm voice. He had kissed her cheek chastely when the ceremony concluded. "Well then, Lady Ravenscross," he had said, the title still strange to Eleanor's ears, "shall we proceed to the wedding breakfast?" It had been the most unromantic wedding imaginable. And yet, as Eleanor had signed her name in the register, Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenscross, she had felt not disappointment, but relief. She had made a sensible choice. She would be safe, secure, and respected. She had not anticipated that she would face James Hartley quite so soon. The ball at Devonshire House was one of the first major social events of the season. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire were renowned for their hospitality, and an invitation to their balls was coveted throughout society. Eleanor had not wanted to attend. She and Alexander had been married for only 3 days, and she felt unequal to facing the scrutiny of the ton quite so soon. But Alexander had been firm. "We will attend," he had said, as they sat across from each other at breakfast in their London townhouse in Berkeley Square. "Society will gossip regardless. Better to appear together, unified and indifferent to their speculation. You are the Duchess of Ravenscross now, Eleanor. Hold your head high." So she had dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that her mother had insisted upon ordering for the occasion. Alexander's wedding gift to her, a magnificent set of sapphires that had belonged to his grandmother, glittered at her throat and ears. Her maid had dressed her hair in an elegant arrangement that made her look, she had to admit, rather more sophisticated than she had ever appeared before. When she had descended the stairs to meet Alexander in the entrance hall, she had caught a flash of something. Surprise, appreciation, in his eyes before his expression returned to its usual controlled politeness. "You look very well, Eleanor," he had said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The carriage ride to Devonshire House had been brief and largely silent. Alexander had seemed preoccupied with his thoughts, and Eleanor had been too nervous to attempt conversation. When they arrived, the butler's announcement had caused a ripple of reaction through the assembled guests. His Grace the Duke of Ravenscross and Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenscross. Eleanor had felt dozens of eyes turned toward them. She had heard the whispers beginning immediately. The Duke was married. When had this happened? To whom? Alexander had kept her hand firmly on his arm as they made their way through the receiving line. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire had greeted them warmly, though Eleanor had detected curiosity beneath their gracious manners. "How delightful to see you married at last, Ravenscross," the Duke of Devonshire had said, "and to such a charming bride. Lady Eleanor, forgive me, I should say, Duchess, you must bring your husband to dine with us soon." They had proceeded into the ballroom, and Eleanor had felt the weight of scrutiny intensifying. Young ladies whispered behind their fans. Dowagers leaned together, nodding significantly. Gentlemen studied Alexander with new interest, clearly reassessing the political implications of his marriage. Eleanor had been standing with her husband near one of the tall windows, accepting congratulations from Lord and Lady Castlereagh when she had seen him, James Hartley. He stood across the room, resplendent in evening dress, his golden hair carefully styled, his handsome face animated as he spoke with a group of gentlemen. Beside him stood his wife, for he had married Georgiana Blackwell the previous year, dressed in white silk and dripping with jewels that likely represented a significant portion of her father's fortune. Eleanor had felt her stomach tighten. She had known she would eventually encounter James in society, but she had hoped for more time to prepare herself. As if sensing her regard, James had looked up. Their eyes had met across the crowded ballroom, and he had smiled. That same charming, slightly mocking smile she remembered so well. He had said something to his wife, who had glanced toward Eleanor with poorly concealed disdain, then had begun making his way through the crowd. Eleanor's hand had tightened on her fan. Alexander, who had been conversing with Lord Castlereagh, had glanced down at her. "Are you quite well?" he had asked quietly. "Perfectly well," Eleanor had lied. James had approached with his characteristic confidence, his wife trailing slightly behind. "Lady Eleanor," he had said, deliberately using her former title, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby guests. "How unexpected to see you here. Still attending these events, I see." Eleanor had felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, James had continued, his tone dripping with false concern. "Still without a husband, Lady Eleanor. What a pity. Though I suppose at your age, with your circumstances, it becomes increasingly difficult." He had smiled, a cruel edge beneath the charm. "Perhaps your expectations are simply too elevated for a young lady with such limited prospects. One must be realistic, after all." The words had landed like physical blows. Several nearby guests had drawn in sharp breaths. Georgiana Hartley had smiled behind her fan. Eleanor had felt 2 years of carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. The humiliation, the anger, the hurt she had buried so deeply, all of it had threatened to overwhelm her. And then she had felt it, a warm, possessive hand settling on her waist, a solid presence at her side, the subtle scent of sandalwood and something uniquely masculine. "I beg your pardon," Alexander had said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet space around them. "I believe you are addressing my wife." James had frozen, his smile faltering. "Your wife?" "Indeed." Alexander's tone had been perfectly polite, but there had been steel beneath the courtesy. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravencross. And this," his hand had tightened slightly on Eleanor's waist, "is my Duchess, Eleanor Blackwood, formerly Lady Eleanor Ashford. We were married 3 days ago." The silence that had descended was absolute. Eleanor had watched, stunned, as the colour drained from James's face. His eyes had darted from Alexander to Eleanor and back again, clearly struggling to process this information. "The Duke of Ravencross?" James had managed, his voice strangled. "Forgive me," Alexander had continued, his tone now carrying an edge of disdain, "but I do not believe we have been introduced. You are—" The cut had been deliberate and devastating. To pretend not to know a Marquis's heir was an insult of the highest order. "Lord James Hartley," James had stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Heir to the Marquis of Pemberton. This is my wife, Lady Hartley." "Ah, yes," Alexander had said, as if only now recalling. "I believe I am acquainted with your father. A decent man, if somewhat burdened by unfortunate investments of late. I trust he is in good health." Another cut, this one referencing rumours that the Marquis's fortune had been significantly diminished by his son-in-law's insistence on expensive renovations to Pemberton Hall. James had seemed unable to formulate a response. His wife had looked equally mortified, her earlier smugness replaced by poorly concealed panic. "I must commend your confidence, Lord Hartley," Alexander had continued, his voice dangerously soft. "To approach my wife and suggest she has limited prospects shows remarkable boldness. Ignorance, certainly, but remarkable nonetheless." I was not aware," James had begun. "Clearly," Alexander had drawn Eleanor closer, a gesture that was unmistakably protective and possessive. "My wife's prospects, I assure you, are quite satisfactory. As the Duchess of Ravenscross, she now ranks above every woman in this room save royalty. Her position in society is secure, her future is assured, and she is—" He had paused, his green eyes boring into James with undisguised contempt, far too valuable to waste another moment on inconsequential conversation. With that, Alexander had smoothly guided Eleanor away, leaving James and his wife standing alone in a circle of fascinated onlookers. Eleanor had felt dizzy. The entire confrontation had lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes had fundamentally altered her position in society. Where James had sought to humiliate her publicly, Alexander had instead elevated her, defended her, and simultaneously destroyed James's pretensions with surgical precision. "Breathe," Alexander had murmured as he led her toward the terrace doors. "Slowly, we shall step outside for air." The cool night air had been a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. Alexander had released her waist, but remained close, his presence a solid comfort. "Thank you," Eleanor had managed, her voice shaking. Thank you." "That man is a fool," Alexander had said flatly. "And his wife is clearly as mercenary as he is. They deserve each other." Eleanor had looked up at him, this man who was her husband, and for the first time had seen past the cold exterior to something warmer beneath. In the moonlight, his features had seemed less severe, almost handsome. "You defended me," she had said softly. "You did not have to do that. We both know this marriage is merely a practical arrangement." Alexander had turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor, I told you when I proposed that I would treat you with respect. That man treated you abominably 2 years ago, and attempted to do so again tonight. I will not tolerate anyone, showing such disrespect to my wife. Whether our marriage began as a practical arrangement or not, you are now the Duchess of Ravenscross. That means something, you mean something." Something had shifted in that moment. Some invisible wall between them had developed the first hairline crack. Before Eleanor could respond, they had been interrupted by the arrival of Lady Castlereagh, who had tactfully suggested they return to the ballroom to continue receiving congratulations from well-wishers. The remainder of the evening had passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation. Eleanor had noticed that James and his wife had departed early, and that the gossip had shifted from speculation about her marriage to gleeful dissection of James's humiliation. By the time they had returned to the townhouse in Berkeley Square, Eleanor had been exhausted. They had stood together in the entrance hall, the house quiet around them. "Thank you again," Eleanor had said, "for what you did tonight, for what you said." Alexander had looked at her with those penetrating green eyes. "I meant every word, Eleanor. You are my wife. I protect what is mine." There had been something possessive in those words, something that had sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Good night, Alexander," she had said softly. "Good night, Duchess." As Eleanor had climbed the stairs to her chambers, she had found herself thinking that perhaps this practical arrangement might prove more complex and more interesting than she had anticipated. The morning after the ball, Eleanor awoke in the grand ducal bedchamber that was now hers, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The room was beautifully appointed in shades of cream and gold, far more luxurious than her chamber at Ashford House had been. A discreet knock at the door preceded the entrance of Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, followed by 2 maids carrying breakfast trays. "Good morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters said with a respectful curtsy. "His Grace requested that breakfast be brought to your room this morning, as he thought you might be fatigued after last evening's event." Eleanor sat up, pulling a wrapper around her shoulders. "That was thoughtful of him. Where is His Grace now?" "In his study, Your Grace. He asked that you join him there when you are dressed, if you are amenable. He said there are matters he wishes to discuss with you." After breakfast and with her maid's assistance, Eleanor dressed in a morning gown of pale green muslin. She took particular care with her appearance, though she could not have said exactly why. When she was ready, she made her way downstairs to Alexander's study. She knocked gently, and his voice called for her to enter. The study was a masculine room lined with bookshelves, dominated by a large mahogany desk. Alexander stood as she entered, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "Good morning," he said. "I trust you slept well?" Yes, thank you, and thank you for having breakfast sent up. That was kind. It was practical, he corrected, though his tone was not harsh. You were exhausted. There was no need for you to observe formal mealtimes in your own home. He gestured to a chair near his desk. Please sit. I wish to speak with you about several matters. Eleanor settled into the chair, curious. Alexander remained standing, one hand resting on the desk. First, he began, I want to ensure you understand the social implications of last night's events. By this afternoon, every drawing room in London will be discussing what occurred between you, myself, and Lord Hartley. The consensus will favour you. Society loves nothing better than seeing a presumptuous gentleman receive his comeuppance. However, you will face increased scrutiny and possibly some jealousy from other ladies who had hoped to secure the position you now hold. I understand, Eleanor said quietly. Good. I will not always be able to attend every social function with you. I have business and political obligations that will occasionally take me away from London. When that occurs, you will need to navigate society on your own. I have confidence in your ability to do so with grace and dignity. He moved to stand by the window, looking out over the garden. Second, I want to address the practical aspects of our marriage. You will have noticed that we maintain separate bedchambers. That arrangement will continue. I will not impose upon you in that regard unless and until we both feel it appropriate. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but appreciated his directness. I see. However, Alexander continued, turning to face her, I do require an heir. Eventually. When you feel comfortable, we can discuss that aspect of our arrangement. There is no immediate urgency. That seems reasonable, Eleanor managed. Third, I want you to understand your position and your authority in this household. You are the Duchess of Ravenscross. The household staff answers to you. The management of our social calendar is your responsibility. You have an annual household allowance of £3,000, more if you require it for legitimate expenses. Mrs. Winters will help you understand the systems already in place, but you have authority to make changes as you see fit. Eleanor's eyes widened. £3,000 was more than her father's entire annual income from his estate. That is very generous. It is appropriate, Alexander corrected. You will have expenses, clothing, charitable donations, gifts, entertainment costs. I will not have my Duchess appearing in shabby gowns or unable to host properly. He returned to the desk and withdrew a small box from a drawer. Which brings me to my final point. Last night you wore my grandmother's sapphires. They suit you well. However, you will need additional jewellery for various occasions. He placed the box on the desk and opened it. Inside lay an exquisite pearl necklace with a diamond clasp, accompanied by matching earrings and a bracelet. Eleanor gasped. Alexander, these are beautiful, but they are yours, he said simply. There are more pieces in the vault, emeralds, rubies, diamonds. Mrs. Winters will show you the collection. Choose what appeals to you. This is too much, Eleanor protested. You have already been so generous with the marriage settlement and— Eleanor, he said her name firmly, drawing her attention to his face. You are my wife. You represent me and this family in society. You will be appropriately adorned. This is not generosity, it is necessity. Moreover, he paused, something flickering in his expression. You are not the mercenary fortune hunter that man implied last night. You agreed to marry me for practical reasons, yes, but not out of greed. I will not have you feeling like a purchased commodity. These gifts are freely given. Something in his tone made Eleanor's throat tighten. She stood, moving closer to him. You are not at all what I expected, Alexander. No? One dark eyebrow arched slightly. What did you expect? I thought you would be cold, indifferent. I thought this would be a marriage in name only, where we lived separate lives under the same roof. And now I think— Eleanor chose her words carefully. I think you are a man who values honor and fairness. I think beneath that stern exterior, you are perhaps kinder than you wish people to know. For a long moment, Alexander simply looked at her, his green eyes searching her face. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. You are perceptive, Duchess. That could prove either very convenient or very dangerous. Dangerous? Eleanor felt bold enough to smile slightly. Should I be concerned? Only if you dislike having your illusions shattered. I am not a romantic hero from one of Mrs. Radcliffe's novels, Eleanor. I am a practical man who built his fortune through hard work and careful planning. I do not write poetry or make grand gestures. I do not want poetry or grand gestures, Eleanor said honestly. I had enough of pretty words from Lord Hartley. They meant nothing. What you did last night, defending me, protecting my dignity, that meant everything. Something shifted in Alexander's expression. His hand lifted, almost as if he might reach for her, but then he seemed to think better of it and lowered it again. We should discuss your schedule for the week, he said, his tone becoming businesslike once more, though Eleanor thought she detected the faintest hint of warmth beneath it. There are several invitations that require responses, and Lady Castlereagh has requested your presence at a ladies' tea on Thursday. I recommend you accept. It will be an opportunity to establish your position among the leading hostesses of the ton. They spent the next hour discussing various social obligations and household matters. Eleanor was impressed by Alexander's thorough knowledge of society's complex web of relationships and his astute understanding of social politics. As she was preparing to leave, Alexander called her back. Eleanor, one more thing. She turned curious. If you encounter Lord Hartley again, and you will inevitably, do not allow him to make you doubt yourself. He is a weak man who sought to elevate himself by diminishing you. His opinion is worthless. Do not give it power. Eleanor smiled, genuinely moved. Thank you, Alexander. I shall try to remember that. As she left the study, she found herself thinking that her practical, unromantic husband had just said something more meaningful than all of James Hartley's flowery compliments combined. The following days brought a deluge of social obligations. Visiting cards piled up in the entrance hall. Invitations arrived by every post. Eleanor found herself thrust into the role of Duchess of Ravenscross with little time to adjust. Lady Castlereagh's tea on Thursday proved to be exactly what Alexander had predicted, an opportunity for the leading ladies of society to assess her and determine where she fit in their carefully structured hierarchy. The gathering was held at Lady Castlereagh's elegant townhouse in St. James's Square. When Eleanor arrived, she found herself in the company of a dozen of the most influential women in London, the Duchess of Devonshire, Lady Jersey, Lady Cowper, and several others whose approval could make or break a young lady's social standing. Your Grace, Lady Castlereagh greeted her warmly. How delightful that you could join us. Do come and sit with us. We are all most eager to become better acquainted with Ravenscross's bride. The afternoon proceeded with the delicate dance of high society conversation. The ladies were too well bred to ask directly impertinent questions, but they probed nonetheless, seeking to understand this young woman who had seemingly appeared from nowhere to secure one of the most eligible matches in England. It was such a surprise to learn of your marriage, Lady Jersey said, her sharp eyes assessing Eleanor over her teacup. We had quite given up on Ravenscross ever taking a bride. What on earth convinced him to abandon his bachelor state? Eleanor smiled politely. I believe His Grace decided it was time to think of establishing his nursery. As for why he chose me, you would have to ask him. I confess I was as surprised as anyone by his proposal. You must have made quite an impression, Lady Cowper observed. Ravenscross is notoriously particular. We have watched scores of young ladies attempt to capture his attention over the years. None succeeded. Perhaps, Eleanor said carefully, His Grace valued intelligence and compatibility over mere beauty or fashion. The Duchess of Devonshire laughed. Tactfully said, my dear, and quite true. Ravenscross would never tolerate a silly wife. He requires someone who can hold her own in conversation and manage his households competently. I suspect he chose very wisely indeed. I witnessed the encounter at our ball, Lady Cowper said, leaning forward with interest. With Lord Hartley. How mortifying that must have been for him, to discover you had married so far above him. I confess, Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. I took no pleasure in Lord Hartley's discomfort. However, I was grateful for my husband's support. He made it clear that he would not tolerate disrespect toward me. Ravenscross is fiercely loyal to those he considers his, Lady Castlereagh said approvingly. You will find, Your Grace, that being his Duchess provides considerable protection. No one will dare slight you now. I have heard, Lady Jersey said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, that your courtship was quite brief. Some might even say, hasty. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. His Grace and I both valued directness over protracted uncertainty. When two practical people find themselves suited to one another, what purpose does delay serve? A refreshingly pragmatic view, the Duchess of Devonshire said. Not the stuff of romantic novels, perhaps, but far more likely to result in a stable marriage. I applaud you both. The conversation moved to other topics, the latest fashions from Paris, the upcoming royal event at Carlton House, speculation about which young ladies would secure matches this season. Eleanor participated when appropriate but mostly listened, learning the subtle currents of influence and rivalry that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. As the afternoon concluded and guests began to depart, Lady Castlereagh drew Eleanor aside. "You handled yourself admirably, my dear," she said quietly. "These ladies can be rather intimidating, I know, but you met them as an equal. That is precisely what Ravencross's Duchess must do. I suspect you will do very well indeed. Thank you, Lady Castlereagh. Your kindness means a great deal to me. One more word of advice, if I may?" Lady Castlereagh's expression turned serious. "Your husband is a powerful man with considerable political influence. That makes him valuable as an ally and dangerous as an enemy. There are those who will attempt to use you to gain access to him or to learn information about his business dealings and political positions. Be cautious about whom you trust." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I shall remember that." As her carriage returned her to Berkeley Square, Eleanor reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than a week. She had gone from being a young woman of modest prospects to one of the most highly ranked ladies in England. It was dizzying and more than a little frightening. When she arrived home, she found Alexander in the drawing room, reviewing correspondence. He looked up as she entered. "How was Lady Castlereagh's tea?" he asked. "Educational," Eleanor said, settling into a chair across from him. "The ladies were polite, but assessing. I believe I passed their evaluation. Though Lady Jersey seemed skeptical about the swiftness of our courtship." Alexander's mouth twitched. "Sally Jersey is skeptical about everything. If she were not, she would not be one of the most influential patronesses of Almack's. Did she trouble you?" "No. I managed adequately, I think. Lady Castlereagh was kind. She also warned me that people might attempt to use me to gain information about your business or political affairs. Emily Castlereagh is a wise woman. Her advice is sound." Alexander set aside his papers and gave her his full attention. "You will be approached, Eleanor. People will befriend you, flatter you, attempt to learn what you know. Be circumspect. Never discuss my business with anyone outside this household." "I understand, though I confess I know very little about your business affairs anyway." "Would you like to know more?" The question surprised her. Yes, actually, I would." Alexander considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. I have a meeting next week with my man of business to review the quarter's accounts for my various estates and investments. If you wish, you may attend. It will be tedious. Much discussion of crop yields, tenant rents, and mining operations, but it will give you a fuller picture of how this family's wealth is managed." Eleanor felt a surge of unexpected pleasure. "You would permit me to attend such a meeting?" "Eleanor, you are my wife. You have a stake in these affairs. Moreover, if something should happen to me before we have a son of age, you would need to understand the business until our heir reaches his majority. It is only practical that you be informed." Practical. That word again. And yet, Eleanor found herself touched by the implicit trust in his offer. "I would very much like to attend," she said. "Thank you." That evening they dined together. A first, as they had previously maintained the habit of separate meals due to Alexander's unpredictable schedule. The conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had expected. Alexander asked intelligent questions about her impressions of various society ladies, and she ventured to ask about his work in the House of Lords. "I am currently concerned about proposed changes to the corn laws," he admitted. "The restrictions on grain imports are causing significant hardship for working people while protecting the interests of large landowners. It is a complicated issue. I am a landowner myself, after all, but I believe the current situation is untenable." "What position will you take?" Eleanor asked. "I will argue for modification of the laws to allow greater imports when domestic prices rise above a certain threshold. It will not make me popular with some of my peers, but it is the right course. Starving the poor to line the pockets of the wealthy is both immoral and ultimately destabilizing to social order. Eleanor found herself impressed by his willingness to take an unpopular stance based on principle rather than self-interest. "That is admirable, Alexander." He looked at her with surprise. "Most ladies would find such topics dreadfully dull." "I am not most ladies," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "My father's estate is not large, but I grew up understanding that our tenants' welfare affected our own. A starving tenant cannot pay rent, and a prosperous one can. It is simple logic, yet many landlords seem not to grasp it." "Your father taught you well," Alexander said. Then, after a pause, "Eleanor, I find I am enjoying your company more than I anticipated. That is, not a complaint." It was perhaps the most emotionally vulnerable statement he had made to her. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'm enjoying your company as well, Alexander. This marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, but I am discovering that compatibility and respect provide a firmer foundation than romantic fancy ever could." Something flickered in his green eyes, pleasure perhaps, or relief. "I am glad you think so." As the evening concluded and they prepared to retire to their separate chambers, Alexander caught her hand gently. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I want you to know that I do not regret our marriage. I chose well." Then, before she could respond, he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture far more intimate than their chaste wedding kiss had been. "Good night, Duchess," he murmured. "Good night, Alexander," she whispered, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. As Eleanor lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking about her husband in ways she had not anticipated. She had married him expecting cold formality. Instead, she was discovering a man of honor, intelligence, and, beneath his stern exterior, genuine kindness. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might, in time, become far more than either of them had bargained for. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's life settled into a new rhythm. The season continued its whirl of balls, dinners, and social calls. She found herself growing more comfortable in her role as Duchess of Ravencross, and society seemed to accept her with increasing warmth, particularly after it became clear that she had the Duke's unequivocal support. James Hartley and his wife were rarely seen at the same events Eleanor attended, and when their paths did cross, James took great care to avoid her entirely. Eleanor found she felt nothing when she saw him. Not anger, not satisfaction, merely indifference. That chapter of her life was closed. What surprised her was the gradual deepening of her relationship with Alexander. It began with small things. Flowers appeared in her sitting room, not grand bouquets meant for display, but smaller arrangements of her favorite blooms, roses and lavender. When she mentioned them to Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper smiled knowingly. "His Grace noticed what flowers you paused to admire in the garden, Your Grace. He instructed the gardener to ensure fresh cuttings are brought to your rooms each week." Alexander himself never mentioned the flowers, but Eleanor noticed that he watched her reaction the first time she discovered a particularly beautiful arrangement, and something in his expression suggested he was pleased. Then there were the books. Alexander had one of the finest private libraries in London, and when he learned of Eleanor's love of reading, he began leaving volumes he thought she might enjoy on the table in her sitting room. Not the insipid romantic novels deemed appropriate for ladies, but works of history, philosophy, and even political economy. "I thought you might find this interesting," he would say casually, handing her a book on the agricultural innovations being implemented in Scotland, or a collection of essays on social reform. The author makes some compelling arguments about land management. They began spending their evenings together more frequently. After dinner, they would retire to the library, where Alexander worked on correspondence while Eleanor read. Often, their reading would spark conversations that lasted hours, debates about politics, discussions of history, analyses of the social issues confronting England. "You have a sharp mind," Alexander told her one evening after a particularly spirited discussion about the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft. "I find myself looking forward to these conversations. Most people simply agree with whatever I say, or if they disagree, cannot articulate why. You challenge me. It is refreshing." "I hope I am not too disputatious," Eleanor said, suddenly concerned that she had overstepped. "Not at all." Alexander's expression was warmer than she had ever seen it. "I married you for your intelligence, Eleanor. I would be disappointed if you concealed it merely to be agreeable." The gifts continued. a beautiful shawl in her favorite shade of blue, a first edition of a book she had mentioned wanting to read, chocolates from a confectioner in Bond Street that she had once praised in passing. "You are spoiling me," she protested, after discovering an exquisite pair of emerald earrings in her jewelry box. "I am providing for my wife," Alexander corrected, though his eyes held a hint of amusement. "There is a difference. Alexander, you have already given me so much." "Eleanor," he stepped closer, his expression serious. "I have wealth beyond what I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What purpose does it serve if not to provide pleasure to those I—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider his words. "To those under my protection," he finished. Eleanor wondered what he had almost said instead. The turning point came one afternoon in late May. Eleanor had been visiting one of the charitable institutions she had begun to patron, an orphanage in Suffolk that provided education and training to destitute children. She had mentioned to Alexander her desire to do meaningful charitable work, and he had not only approved, but had provided generous funding. She returned to Berkeley Square that afternoon, tired but satisfied, her dress dusty from the orphanage's crowded conditions. As she entered the house, she nearly collided with Alexander in the entrance hall. "Goodness," she exclaimed, "I did not expect you home so early." He steadied her with his hands on her shoulders, then frowned. "You are covered in dust. Where have you been?" "The orphanage in Suffolk. We were organizing the new schoolroom, and I fear I got rather more involved in moving furniture than was strictly necessary." "You were moving furniture?" His frown deepened. "Eleanor, you have servants for such tasks." "The children were so excited about their new school space. I could hardly stand by doing nothing." She smiled up at him. "Besides, I am perfectly capable of moving a few chairs." For a long moment, Alexander simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine laugh that transformed his usually stern features. "You are extraordinary," he said, his hands still resting on her shoulders. "Most duchesses consider it beneath their dignity to even visit such establishments, let alone roll up their sleeves and work alongside the staff." "Then most duchesses are missing the satisfaction of genuine accomplishment," Eleanor replied. "Writing a bank draft is charitable, certainly, but seeing those children's faces when they entered their new schoolroom, that was worth a bit of dust." Something shifted in Alexander's expression. His hands slid from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began beating faster. "Yes? This marriage, this practical arrangement, it has become something more for me. I did not anticipate it. I did not plan for it, but I find that He paused, seeming to struggle with unfamiliar emotions. "I find that I care for you, deeply, not merely as the woman I married for practical reasons, but as yourself. Your intelligence, your kindness, your spirit, they have captivated me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Alexander, I am not skilled at pretty speeches," he continued, his green eyes intense. "I cannot offer you poetry or romantic declarations, but I can offer you honesty. You have become important to me, Eleanor, more important than I knew anyone could be, and He took a breath. "I would very much like our marriage to become more than a mere arrangement, if you are willing." Eleanor felt tears prickling her eyes, not tears of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. This stern, practical man who claimed not to understand romance had just offered her something more precious than any flowery declaration, complete honesty and genuine feeling. "I am willing," she whispered, "more than willing. You have shown me what real devotion looks like, Alexander. Not pretty words, but consistent actions. Not grand gestures, but daily kindness. I did not expect to feel this way when I married you, but I find that I have come to care for you deeply as well." The kiss, when it came, was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. It was passionate, demanding, and yet somehow tender, an expression of feelings too powerful for words. Eleanor's arms went around his neck, and his pulled her close as if he could not bear to have any distance between them. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I should let you rest," he said, though he made no move to release her. "You have had a long day." "Alexander," Eleanor said softly. "Yes? I think perhaps we need not maintain separate chambers any longer, if you agree." His arms tightened around her. "Are you certain?" I do not wish to rush you. I am certain. She looked up at him, her grey eyes meeting his green ones. I want to be your wife in every sense, Alexander. Not because of duty or the need for an heir, but because I want to be close to you. The heat in his gaze made her breath catch. Tonight, then, he said, his voice rough. Come to my chamber tonight, Eleanor. Let me show you how precious you have become to me. That evening, Eleanor dismissed her maid early and made her way to Alexander's chamber with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He was waiting for her, dressed in a brocade dressing gown, his dark hair slightly disheveled in a way that made him look younger and less severe. Eleanor, he breathed as she entered. You came. Of course I came. Did you doubt I would? I doubted my own worthiness, he admitted. I am not an easy man, Eleanor. I am too serious, too focused on duty. You deserve someone who can sweep you off your feet with romance and poetry. Eleanor crossed the room to stand before him. I tried romance and poetry with James Hartley. They meant nothing because there was no substance beneath them. You have given me something far more valuable: respect, trust, and genuine care. That is worth more than all the poetry in the world. What followed was tender and passionate in equal measure. Alexander was careful with her, attentive to her comfort and pleasure, and when the initial discomfort faded, Eleanor discovered a physical connection as deep and satisfying as their intellectual partnership had become. Afterward, as they lay together in the lamplight, Alexander held her close, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. I love you, he said quietly. I did not think I was capable of such feeling, but I love you, Eleanor. You have transformed my life. Eleanor turned in his arms to look at him. And I love you, Alexander, completely and truly. He kissed her again, softly this time, a seal on promises spoken and unspoken. I never imagined, Eleanor murmured against his chest, when I accepted your practical proposal, that I would find such happiness. Nor did I, Alexander admitted. I thought I was arranging a convenient marriage. Instead, I found my match, my partner, my love. You are everything I did not know I needed, Eleanor. They talked long into the night, sharing confidences and dreams, building the foundation of a marriage that had already become far more than either had anticipated. From that night forward, Eleanor moved into Alexander's chambers permanently, and their marriage blossomed into something neither practical nor convenient, but rather passionate, devoted, and deeply fulfilling. Society, of course, noticed the change. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross were observed to be remarkably attentive to one another, dancing together frequently, conversing with evident pleasure, and displaying a level of affection unusual among couples of their rank. The Duke is quite besotted, Lady Jersey observed to Lady Cowper at one particularly crowded ball. Who would have thought it? Cold Ravenscross, warm at last. She has been good for him, Lady Cowper agreed, and he clearly adores her. Look how he watches her, as if she is the only person in the room. Indeed, Alexander's devotion became legendary. He was observed bringing her refreshments before she asked, ensuring she was comfortable, and cutting short conversations with boring guests to return to her side. He consulted her opinions on matters of business and politics, trusted her judgment on social matters, and made it clear to everyone that his Duchess was his partner in all things. For Eleanor, the transformation was equally profound. The wounded young woman who had accepted a loveless marriage for security had blossomed into a confident duchess who knew she was cherished. She moved through society with grace and assurance, secure in her position and in her husband's affection. They encountered James Hartley one more time that season at a garden party hosted by the Duke of Richmond. Eleanor saw him across the lawn and felt nothing but mild pity. He looked older somehow, his face drawn, and his wife appeared perpetually discontented. Alexander, noticing her glance, drew her closer. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "None whatsoever," Eleanor replied honestly. "I am grateful to him, actually." "Grateful?" Alexander's eyebrow rose. "If he had not rejected me so publicly, I would never have been available when you decided to marry. His cruelty led me to you. How can I regret that?" Alexander's expression softened. "You are generous, my love. Far more generous than he deserves." "I am simply happy," Eleanor said, looking up at him. "Deliriously, perfectly happy, with you." He kissed her forehead, unconcerned with who might observe. "And I with you. always. As the season drew to a close and they prepared to remove to Ravenscross Abbey, Alexander's primary estate in Hampshire, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. She had entered into marriage expecting mere security and respect. Instead, she had found passionate love, genuine partnership, and a happiness she had never imagined possible. "Are you pleased to leave London?" Alexander asked as they travelled southward in their luxurious carriage. "I am pleased to be wherever you are," Eleanor replied simply, "whether that is London, Hampshire, or anywhere else in the world." Alexander pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, perfectly content. Their practical arrangement had become a love match. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she was the most fortunate woman in all of England. Ravenscross Abbey proved to be even more magnificent than Eleanor had imagined. The great house, built in the Elizabethan era and modernized over successive generations, sprawled across a landscaped park that encompassed woodlands, formal gardens, and a picturesque lake. "This is your home now," Alexander said as their carriage approached the house, his hand covering hers. "I hope you will be happy here." "How could I not be?" Eleanor breathed, taking in the golden stone walls and mullioned windows that glowed in the afternoon sun. "It is beautiful, Alexander." The household staff had assembled to greet their new mistress, and Eleanor was gratified by the warmth of their reception. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper at Ravenscross, was a matronly woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely delighted to welcome a duchess to the estate. "We have all been hoping His Grace would marry," she confided as she showed Eleanor through the house. "This great place needs a family to make it truly a home, and if I may be bold, Your Grace, His Grace seems remarkably happy. The staff have all noticed the change in him." Over the following weeks, Eleanor settled into country life with surprising ease. She worked with Mrs. Patterson to understand the household's rhythms, visited the tenants with Alexander to learn about estate management, and began planning improvements to the estate's small school and almshouse. But the greatest change came in her relationship with Alexander. Away from the scrutiny and formality of London society, they were free to simply be themselves, a husband and wife who genuinely delighted in each other's company. They rode together most mornings, exploring the estate's extensive grounds. Alexander was an excellent horseman, and he patiently helped Eleanor improve her skills, his hands steadying her waist as he gave instructions, his praise generous when she mastered a new technique. "You are a natural," he told her, after she successfully jumped a low fence for the first time. "I knew you had the courage for it." "I am merely motivated by your confidence in me," Eleanor replied, flushed with pleasure. "You make me believe I can accomplish anything." "You can," he said seriously. "You are one of the most capable people I know, Eleanor. Never doubt that." Their evenings were spent in comfortable companionship. Sometimes Alexander worked on estate business while Eleanor read or worked on her correspondence. Sometimes they played chess or card games. Often they simply talked, sharing their thoughts on everything from philosophy to the day's small domestic concerns. And their nights were filled with increasing passion and tenderness. Alexander proved to be an attentive and generous lover, and Eleanor discovered depths of feeling and sensation she had never imagined. Their physical intimacy deepened their emotional connection, creating a bond that felt unbreakable. "I never knew marriage could be like this," Eleanor confessed one night as they lay tangled together, the moonlight streaming through the windows. "I thought it would be duty and obligation. Instead, it is joy." Alexander's arms tightened around her. "You have taught me what it means to truly love someone, Eleanor. Before you, I understood duty, responsibility, honor, but I did not understand how it felt to care for someone more than myself, to want their happiness above my own. You have transformed me. We have transformed each other," Eleanor corrected softly. "I was so guarded when we married, Alexander, so afraid to be hurt again. You have shown me that trust and vulnerability are not weaknesses but strengths." In late August, Eleanor realized that her monthly courses had not arrived. A visit from the local physician confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was with child. She told Alexander that evening as they sat together in the library after dinner. He had been reviewing accounts, and she had been attempting to focus on a book, but her mind had been too full of her news to concentrate. "Alexander," she said, setting her book aside, "I have something to tell you." He looked up immediately, catching the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you well?" "I am very well," she smiled. "I am expecting a child. We are going to have a baby." For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her. Then his face broke into a smile of such radiant joy that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "A child," he whispered. "Eleanor, truly, truly." "The physician confirmed it this afternoon. I am perhaps 2 months along. The baby will come in the spring." Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "Eleanor, my love, this is... I cannot find words. You have given me everything. Everything. We have given each other everything," Eleanor corrected, tilting her face up for his kiss. That night Alexander was especially tender with her, treating her with such reverent care that she finally had to laugh. "I am not going to break, Alexander. Women have been bearing children since the beginning of time. Not my wife," he said stubbornly, "not the woman who holds my heart. I will not risk your health or comfort for anything." His protectiveness, while occasionally excessive, touched Eleanor deeply. Over the following months, as her body changed and the baby grew, Alexander ensured she had the finest care, the best food, and every comfort he could provide. He read medical texts about childbirth and pregnancy, questioning the physician about every detail. He had a resting couch installed in the library so she could be near him while he worked. He personally ensured that her favorite foods were always available and that the nursery was being prepared to the highest standards. "You are fussing," Eleanor told him one afternoon in December when she was nearly 7 months along and feeling ungainly. "I am perfectly healthy, Alexander. Women do not need to be wrapped in cotton wool merely because they are breeding." "My woman does," he said firmly. Then, more gently, "Humor me, Eleanor. You are carrying the most precious cargo in the world, our child and yourself. Let me take care of you." How could she argue with that? London society heard of the Duchess's condition through the carefully worded announcement Alexander had inserted in the newspapers. Congratulations poured in, along with gifts and letters of advice from seemingly every lady in England who had ever borne a child. Among the letters was one from Eleanor's mother, filled with motherly advice and excitement about becoming a grandmother. But there was also a brief note from a source Eleanor had not expected, Lady Castlereagh. "My dear Duchess," it read, "I am delighted to hear of your happy news. Ravenscroft is one of the finest men I know, and I am certain he is beside himself with joy and concern. Do not let him fuss too much. Husbands can be trying in their protectiveness, but it comes from a place of love. I hope you will return to London for the season after your confinement. Society has been dreadfully dull without the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft to enliven it. Your devoted friend, Emily Castlereagh." Eleanor smiled at the note. She had made genuine friends in London, she realized. Women who valued her for herself, not merely for her position. There was no communication from James Hartley or his wife, which was exactly as Eleanor preferred. That chapter of her life was so thoroughly closed that she rarely thought of them at all. Winter settled over Hampshire, blanketing Ravenscroft Abbey in snow. Eleanor found she loved the estate in winter. The way the frost sparkled on the windows, the roaring fires in every room, the sense of cozy intimacy as the household drew closer together against the cold. On Christmas Eve, Alexander gave her a gift that made her weep, a miniature portrait of the two of them, painted by a talented local artist based on sketches he had commissioned without her knowledge. "So our child will always know how we looked in these early days of our marriage," Alexander explained, his hand resting gently on her swollen belly. "I want them to see how much we loved each other even before they arrived." "Alexander," Eleanor whispered, "you are going to make me cry, and I am already overly emotional." He kissed her tears away gently. "I love you, Eleanor, more than I have words to express. You have given me a life I never imagined I could have, a home filled with love instead of merely duty. And now a child. You are my entire world." "And you are mine," Eleanor replied, her hand covering his where it rested on her belly. "Always." The baby came on a bright April morning, arriving with considerably less drama than everyone had feared. Eleanor's labor was relatively brief, and when Alexander was finally allowed into the chamber to meet his child, he found Eleanor tired but glowing with joy, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "Alexander," she said softly, "come meet your daughter." A daughter. Alexander approached almost reverently, his eyes wide as he looked down at the tiny, perfect face. "She is beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect, like her mother. Would you like to hold her?" Eleanor asked. With exquisite care, Alexander took his daughter into his arms. The baby's eyes, already showing hints of the green she would inherit from her father, blinked up at him solemnly. And in that moment, Alexander Blackwood, the powerful Duke of Ravenscross, fell completely and helplessly in love for the second time in his life. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I am your papa, and I promise you, I will spend every day of my life ensuring you are happy, safe and loved. You and your mama, you are my everything." They named her Catherine Eleanor Blackwood, in honor of both Alexander's grandmother and Eleanor herself. Little Catherine, or Kate as she quickly became known, proved to be a contented baby, with her mother's gentle temperament and her father's striking eyes. Alexander was a devoted father, surprising even Eleanor with his hands-on involvement in his daughter's care. He insisted on spending time with Kate daily, holding her while Eleanor rested, talking to her about everything from estate management to philosophy, as if she could understand every word. "She is a brilliant listener," he told Eleanor seriously. "Very attentive." "She is 3 months old," Eleanor laughed. "She is listening to the sound of your voice, not the content. Nonetheless, it is never too early to begin her education." Watching Alexander with their daughter filled Eleanor with a joy so profound it sometimes made her breathless. This stern, practical man who had proposed a convenient marriage had become the most loving of husbands and devoted of fathers. He proved that love could grow from respect and trust, that passion could develop from compatibility, and that the strongest bonds were built on honesty and genuine care. When Kate was 6 months old, they returned to London for the season. Eleanor had regained her figure and felt more confident than ever in her position. As they entered the first ball of the season, hosted once again by the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, they caused quite a stir. "The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross are positively radiant," Lady Jersey observed. "Marriage and parenthood have clearly agreed with them." Indeed, Alexander and Eleanor were observed to be as attentive to each other as ever, perhaps even more so. They danced together repeatedly, conversed with evident pleasure, and made it clear that their devotion had only deepened with time. Eleanor caught sight of James Hartley across the ballroom. He looked older now, his face lined with dissatisfaction. His wife stood nearby, clearly haranguing him about something, her expression pinched and unhappy. They were, Eleanor realized with a mixture of pity and satisfaction, exactly what they deserved to be, miserable together. As if sensing her regard, James looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Eleanor smiled, not with triumph or malice, but with genuine contentment. She had nothing to prove to James Hartley. She had found real love, genuine partnership, and perfect happiness. James's expression flickered, recognition, regret, perhaps even shame before he looked away. "Thinking of your past?" Alexander murmured, appearing at her side and placing his hand on her waist in that possessive gesture she had come to love. "Only long enough to be grateful for it," Eleanor replied honestly. "If James had not been cruel, I might have accepted one of those lesser offers and never been available when you decided to marry. His rejection led me to you. I cannot regret that." "Then I suppose I should thank him," Alexander said, though his tone suggested he would do no such thing. "Though I prefer to simply be grateful for my extraordinary good fortune in securing you as my wife." "Our mutual good fortune," Eleanor corrected. "I am equally blessed, Alexander." He kissed her temple, unconcerned with propriety or watching eyes. "Dance with me again, Duchess. Let all of London see that the Duke of Ravenscross is hopelessly devoted to his wife." "Gladly, Your Grace," Eleanor replied with a smile. As they moved together through the familiar patterns of the waltz, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered marriage expecting mere security and respect. Instead, she had found passionate love, genuine partnership, and a happiness beyond anything she had imagined possible. She had been rejected and humiliated by a man who valued wealth over character, status over substance. That pain had led her to accept a practical proposal from a stern duke who promised only honesty and respect, and from that practical beginning had grown the greatest love story Eleanor could have imagined. Not a fairy tale of love at first sight or romantic declarations, but something deeper and more real. A partnership built on trust, respect, and genuine care that had blossomed into profound and lasting love. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked as they danced. "That I am the most fortunate woman in England," Eleanor replied honestly. "That I love you beyond measure. And that our daughter is the perfect embodiment of our love." "Our daughter," Alexander repeated, his eyes softening. "And perhaps, in time, a brother or sister for her, if you are willing?" "I am very willing," Eleanor whispered. "I want a house full of children, Alexander, a family built on love." "Then a family we shall have," he promised. "Everything you want, Eleanor. Always." As the music swelled and they moved together in perfect harmony, Eleanor caught sight of their reflection in one of the ballroom's tall mirrors. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross, powerful, respected, and quite obviously devoted to each other. A perfect partnership in every sense. James Hartley had mocked her, suggesting she had no prospects, implying she was not good enough. He had been spectacularly wrong. She had not only secured a position far above anything he could have offered, but she had found something infinitely more valuable: true love with a man who cherished her completely. "No regrets?" Alexander murmured against her ear. "None whatsoever," Eleanor replied, meeting his eyes. "Only gratitude. For you, for our daughter, for this life we have built together." "And I," Alexander said softly, "am grateful every day that you agreed to my practical proposal, that you gave me the chance to learn what love truly means. You are my life, Eleanor, my love, my everything." As the ball continued around them and London society watched with approval and perhaps a touch of envy, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross danced on, a perfect picture of what marriage could be when built on honesty, respect, and deepening affection. Eleanor had been publicly humiliated by a man who thought only of wealth and status. But that humiliation had led her to a man who valued intelligence, character, and genuine partnership. A man who had proven that the deepest love often grows from the most unlikely beginnings. And if James Hartley occasionally regretted his choices as he watched the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross from across crowded ballrooms, if he wondered what his life might have been had he possessed the wisdom to value substance over superficiality, well, that was only fitting. Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenscross, had everything she could want: a devoted husband, a beautiful daughter, security, respect, and most importantly, love. Real, deep, transformative love that grew stronger with each passing day. She had been rejected by a fool and chosen by a duke, but more importantly, she had been loved by a good man, and she loved him in return. And that, Eleanor thought as Alexander held her close and they moved together through the dance, was the greatest triumph of all. 5 years later, Ravenscross Abbey was no longer the quiet, formal establishment it had been when Eleanor first arrived. Now it rang with the laughter and chatter of children. Not only Catherine, now a lively 5-year-old with her father's intelligence and her mother's kindness, but also her younger siblings, 3-year-old Thomas, who had inherited his father's dark hair and serious demeanor, and baby Victoria, just 6 months old, and already showing signs of having her sister's sweet temperament. Eleanor stood at the nursery window, watching as Alexander played with Catherine and Thomas in the garden below. He had Kate perched on his shoulders, while Thomas clung to his leg, both children shrieking with delight as their dignified father pretended to be a fearsome beast stalking through the rose garden. "His Grace is very good with the children," Mrs. Patterson observed, coming to stand beside Eleanor with baby Victoria in her arms. Such a change from the serious young man who inherited this estate all those years ago. "Love changes people," Eleanor said softly, taking Victoria from the housekeeper and settling the baby against her shoulder. "It certainly changed both of us." Indeed, Alexander had continued to thaw over their years of marriage, becoming warmer and more openly affectionate not only with his family but with his staff and tenants as well. He was still formidable in business and politics, still commanded respect throughout England, but those who knew him well saw the genuine kindness beneath his stern exterior. And Eleanor had blossomed into a duchess in the truest sense, not merely holding a title, but actively working to improve the lives of those around her. Her charitable work had expanded to include 3 orphanages, 2 schools, and a hospital for the poor. She was respected throughout society, not just as the Duke's wife, but as a capable and compassionate woman in her own right. Their marriage had become the stuff of legend in London society. The love match Duke and Duchess, Lady Jersey had dubbed them, and the name had stuck. Young ladies sighed over their story, and young gentlemen were reminded by their mothers that true devotion and respect mattered more than superficial charm. As for James Hartley, Eleanor rarely thought of him anymore. She had heard through the ever-efficient society gossip network that his marriage remained unhappy, and that his father's finances had never recovered from the disastrous investments he had made. James had produced no heir, and there were rumors that his wife blamed him for her failure to conceive. Eleanor felt only pity for them both. They had sought wealth and status at the expense of genuine affection, and they had reaped exactly what they had sown. "Mamma, Mamma," Catherine's voice called from below. "Come down, Papa says he will let us have ices if you agree." Eleanor laughed, opening the window to call down. "Did he indeed? And what makes you think I am the one who makes decisions about ices?" "Because Papa does whatever you say," Catherine replied with the devastating honesty of a 5-year-old. Alexander looked up, his face breaking into the warm smile he reserved only for his family. "She is not wrong, you know. Come down, my love. Enjoy this beautiful day with us." Eleanor's heart swelled with love as she looked at her family, her strong, devoted husband, her bright, beautiful children, her life that had exceeded every dream she had once thought impossible. "I shall be right down," she called, "but someone needs to convince me that ices before dinner is acceptable." "I love you," Catherine shouted. "Is that convincing?" "Very convincing indeed," Eleanor laughed. As she turned from the window, baby Victoria gurgling contentedly in her arms, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. She had begun as a young woman with modest prospects, been publicly humiliated by a man who valued wealth over character, and accepted a practical proposal from a stern duke who promised only honesty and respect. From that unpromising beginning had grown the deepest love, the truest partnership, and the most profound happiness Eleanor could have imagined. She had not married for love, but she had found it nonetheless. Found it, nurtured it, and watched it grow into something magnificent. "Come along, little one," she murmured to Victoria as she headed downstairs. "Let us join your papa and siblings. Let us enjoy this beautiful life we have been blessed with." As Eleanor emerged into the garden, and Alexander's face lit up at the sight of her, as Catherine and Thomas ran to embrace her, as her husband kissed her tenderly and took Victoria from her arms with practiced ease, she knew with absolute certainty that she was the most fortunate woman in all of England. Not because she had married a duke, though that had brought its own advantages. Not because she had wealth and status, though those had provided security and comfort. But because she had married a good man who loved her, who respected her, who cherished her and their children above all else. She had been rejected by a fool and chosen by a wise man. But more importantly, she had been loved, truly, deeply, passionately loved, by the best of men. And she loved him in return with every fibre of her being. And that, Eleanor thought as Alexander put his arm around her waist and they watched their children play together in the sunshine, was the greatest triumph of all. The practical marriage had become the love match of the century, and Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenscross, lived happily ever after, not because of magic or fairy tale romance, but because she and her husband had chosen each other day after day, building a love that would last a lifetime. The end. Thank you for joining us on Eleanor and Alexander's journey. Their story reminds us that love can grow from the most unexpected beginnings, that respect and trust form the foundation of lasting happiness, and that the deepest connections are built through consistent care and genuine devotion. In a world that often values superficial charm over substance, Eleanor and Alexander found each other and built something real, something lasting, something beautiful. May we all be blessed with partnerships built on such solid ground. Until our next story, may you find your own happy ending, not through fairy tale magic, but through the very real magic of choosing to love and be loved in return. With love. The Legends of the Full Team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and writing a comment below. Your support, from the bottom of our hearts, means everything to our small team, and it's what keeps us inspired to tell more stories filled with love, redemption, and dramatic turns of fate. At the end of this video, you'll see a recommendation for another unforgettable story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be swept away once more by the power of emotional, historical romance. With all our gratitude, the Legends of the Fall team. Victorian England, 1847. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones as Lady Diana Russell gazed out at the dreary London fog enveloping the city. Rain tapped against the windows, matching the nervous rhythm of her heart. Her gloved fingers twisted anxiously in her lap, creasing the expensive fabric of her travelling dress, a dress that had cost her father's last remaining guineas. "We are nearly there, my lady," her lady's maid Martha whispered, breaking the oppressive silence that had accompanied them since departing from Russell House that morning. Diana nodded, unable to find her voice. The knot in her stomach tightened as the carriage turned onto a grand avenue lined with stately townhouses. In less than an hour she would meet the man who was to become her husband, the Marquis of Blackwood, Lord George Churchill, a man she had never met, but whose reputation preceded him. Cold, calculating, powerful. The Russell estate was in ruins. Her father, the once respected Earl of Harlington, had gambled away their fortune before passing away in a riding accident 3 months prior, leaving Diana and her ailing mother with nothing but crushing debt and a crumbling manor. The marriage contract with the Marquis promised to save what remained of their family lands and provide for her mother's medical care. "Is it wrong to feel like a sacrificial lamb, Martha?" Diana asked quietly, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Being sold to save what remains of the Russell name, Martha's weathered face softened with sympathy. She had been with Diana since childhood and was the closest thing to family she had left, besides her bedridden mother. "It's an honourable thing you're doing, my lady. There's no shame in securing your family's future." "Honour?" Diana repeated with a hollow laugh. "How strange that my honour is measured by my willingness to marry a stranger." The carriage finally pulled through imposing iron gates and up a long winding drive. Blackwood Manor emerged from the mist, a massive stone structure with Gothic turrets and chimneys stretching toward the grey skies like grasping fingers. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once, its windows dark and unwelcoming despite the early afternoon hour. Diana's throat tightened. This formidable place would be her prison or her home, depending on the mercy of its master. "Remember your training, my lady," Martha said softly, reaching over to straighten Diana's bonnet. "Shoulders back, chin high." Diana squared her shoulders beneath her travelling cloak. "I am a Russell. I will not show fear." "That's the spirit," Martha nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be proud." The carriage lurched to a stop on the gravelled forecourt. A footman appeared, opening the door and extending an umbrella. Diana descended, her legs stiff from the long journey. The house loomed over her, even more imposing up close, its stone facade darkened by decades of London smoke and fog. A butler awaited at the entrance, his posture as rigid as the marble columns flanking the door. "Lady Diana Russell," he intoned with a formal bow. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. I am Harrison, the butler. If you would follow me, the Marquis awaits in his study." Diana was escorted through a labyrinth of hallways, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and priceless artifacts from across the empire, evidence of the Churchill family's extensive wealth and influence. The grandeur of the house made her family's once proud manor seem like a cottage in comparison. Every footstep echoed on the marble floors, announcing her presence in this domain where she was still a stranger. "Your maid will be shown to the servants' quarters," Harrison informed her as they approached a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor. "The Marquis prefers to speak with you privately." Diana's stomach clenched, but she nodded. "Thank you, Harrison." "The Marquis will see you now, Lady Russell," the butler announced, opening the door with a practiced flourish. Taking a deep breath, Diana stepped into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The study was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, behind which stood a tall figure silhouetted against a rain-streaked window. He turned slowly at her entrance, and Diana caught her breath. Lord George Churchill was not what she had expected. Though his face was set in severe lines, he was undeniably handsome. perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his attire immaculate. There was a coldness to his bearing that made Diana shiver despite the fire burning in the grate. "Lady Diana Russell," he said, his voice deep and devoid of warmth. It was a statement, not a question. She curtsied gracefully as she had been taught. "My lord, I trust your journey was comfortable." He gestured to a chair positioned before his desk. "Please sit." Diana perched on the edge of the offered seat, her back straight as a board, hands folded demurely in her lap as she had been instructed since childhood. "Yes, thank you for arranging the carriage." The Marquis remained standing, studying her with clinical detachment, as though she were a horse at auction. His gaze travelled from her face to her modest travelling attire and back again, assessing her value. Diana fought the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. "I've reviewed the contract your solicitor sent," he finally said, moving to a side table where documents were neatly arranged. "Everything appears to be in order." He walked to a sideboard and poured himself a glass of amber liquid without offering her refreshment. "I assume you understand the terms of our arrangement." "I do," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Your financial support in exchange for the Russell name joining with the Churchills." "Precisely." He took a measured sip from his glass. "I require an heir, and society expects a man in my position to have a wife. Your bloodline is impeccable despite your father's indiscretions." Diana flinched at the reference to her father, but kept her composure. "And the Russell estate will be restored." "It will be managed properly," he corrected, his tone making it clear there was a significant difference. "Under my supervision. Your mother will be provided for, and your family name preserved." He set his glass down with a sharp click against the wooden surface. "But let us be perfectly clear about what this is, and what it is not." He approached her, his expression unreadable as he stood uncomfortably close. Diana could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something else she couldn't name. "I should make something clear before we proceed, Lady Diana. While this union will be legal in every sense, you should harbour no romantic illusions. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." Diana met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite her racing heart. "I understand perfectly, my lord." "Good." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Then I shall be plain. You will have your own apartments in the East Wing. You will fulfill your social obligations as the Marchioness of Blackwood. You will behave with propriety at all times. But make no mistake," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "you will never be my true wife." The words cut through her like ice, but Diana refused to show how deeply they wounded her pride. She had expected a loveless marriage, but the cold finality of his declaration still stung like a slap. "Is that understood?" he pressed, his blue eyes boring into hers. Something within Diana, the same stubborn pride that had sustained her through her father's disgrace and death, flared to life. She rose from her chair, squaring her shoulders to face him directly, though he still towered over her. "Perfectly, my lord. And I hope you understand that I am not entering this arrangement with any delusions of affection. I do this for my family, just as you do this for yours. I require no false sentiment, only the respect due to the future bearer of your name and the mother of your heirs." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her boldness, before his expression hardened once more. "The wedding will take place in 3 days' time. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, will show you to your rooms and acquaint you with the household schedule." He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal. "Good day, Lady Diana." As the door closed behind her, Diana fought to maintain her composure. A severe-looking woman awaited in the corridor, Mrs. Winters, presumably, who led her through another maze of corridors to the East Wing without a single word of welcome. The rooms assigned to her were spacious and luxuriously appointed, with silk damask wallpaper and heavy velvet draperies, yet they felt as cold and impersonal as her future husband. Nothing about them spoke of warmth or comfort, merely wealth displayed for its own sake. "Dinner is served at 7 precisely," Mrs. Winters informed her, her tone suggesting that tardiness would be an unforgivable sin. "The Marquis dines alone most evenings, but expects you to join him tonight. Your maid will be up shortly with your belongings." When the housekeeper had gone, Diana sank onto a brocade settee, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. She had known what she was sacrificing when she agreed to this arrangement, But the reality of her future, stretching before her like a vast, empty plain, was more daunting than she had imagined. Martha arrived soon after, fussing over Diana's appearance and unpacking her modest trousseau into the massive wardrobes. "The servants are all aflutter about you," she reported, as she brushed out Diana's travel-worn dress. "It seems the Marquis hasn't entertained a lady at Blackwood Manor since his father died 3 years ago." "I am hardly being entertained," Diana said wryly. "I am a business acquisition, nothing more." Martha clucked her tongue. Now, things may not be as bleak as they appear. The Marquis is young yet, and handsome enough. Perhaps in time—" "No, Martha," Diana interrupted gently. "The Marquis has made his position quite clear. This marriage is a transaction, not a romance." She moved to the window, gazing out at the formal gardens below, now shrouded in mist. "I would rather face the truth than nurture false hope." That evening, dinner was a silent affair, broken only by the clink of silver against fine china and the occasional murmured instruction to the footman. The Marquis spoke little, and Diana, exhausted from the journey and their earlier encounter, had no energy for meaningless pleasantries. When they parted in the grand hallway, he merely inclined his head. "Until tomorrow, Lady Diana." That night, alone in her new bedchamber with its elaborate furnishings and oppressive silence, Diana stood at the window, watching moonlight break through the clouds to illuminate the formal gardens below. "I may never be his true wife," she whispered to herself, "but I will not be broken by this place or by him. I am Diana Russell of Harlington, and I still have my pride." She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "This may be a prison of circumstance, but I will find a way to make it bearable. I must." Little did she know that fate had other plans for the Marquis of Blackwood and his reluctant bride. 3 days later, Diana stood in St. George's Church in Hanover Square, wearing a wedding gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace, a gown chosen and paid for by her soon-to-be husband. Her mother was too ill to attend, but had sent a small pearl brooch, the last of her jewelry that hadn't been sold to pay creditors, which Diana wore pinned over her heart. The church was filled with London's elite, though Diana recognized few faces. They had come not out of affection for either bride or groom, but out of curiosity, eager to witness the union between the notorious Marquis and the daughter of the disgraced Earl. Diana stood perfectly still as the Archbishop performed the ceremony, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. The Marquis stood beside her, equally impassive, reciting his vows with the detached precision of a man conducting a routine business transaction. When he slid the gold band onto her finger, his touch was impersonal, his expression unchanged. He spoke his vows clearly and without hesitation, but there was no warmth in his words, no promise of devotion beyond what was written in their contract. As they rode back to Blackwood Manor in silence, now husband and wife, Diana caught the Marquis studying her reflection in the carriage window. "You played your part well," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her directly since the ceremony. "The Tun will have nothing to gossip about regarding the ceremony. I am gratified to have met with your approval, my lord," she replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but perhaps the closest thing to it she had seen. "You have spirit, Lady Diana. That may serve you well in society so long as it is properly contained." The wedding breakfast was an elaborate affair, with countless dishes and fine wines, yet Diana could barely eat, her stomach knotted with tension. She performed her duties as the new Marchioness, smiling at the right moments, conversing pleasantly with guests who had come more out of curiosity than genuine goodwill. As she circulated among the crowd, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Poor girl. Cold as ice, that one. Married for the money, no doubt." Each barbed comment strengthened her resolve to maintain her dignity. She would not give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her distress. By evening, when the last guests had departed, Diana was exhausted, her face aching from the effort of maintaining her pleasant expression. She retreated to her chambers as instructed, relieved when there was no summons from her husband. Their arrangement, it seemed, extended to all aspects of marriage. As Martha helped her out of the elaborate wedding gown, Diana caught sight of herself in the mirror, the Marchioness of Blackwood, a title without substance, a wife in name only. Perhaps it is better this way. she said quietly, as Martha unpinned her hair. "At least I know precisely where I stand." "It's early days yet, my lady," Martha said, arranging Diana's hair in a simple braid for the night. "Who knows what time may bring?" But as she lay awake in her bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Blackwood Manor, Diana couldn't help but wonder about the man sleeping in another wing of the house. What had made him so cold? Why did he need this marriage if he wanted no true wife? The Marquis's words echoed in her mind. "You will never be my true wife." Diana pulled the covers tighter around herself as a chill wind rattled the windows. "We shall see, my lord," she whispered into the darkness. "We shall see." The weeks following the wedding unfolded in a pattern of careful routine at Blackwood Manor. Diana rose each morning to breakfast alone in her sitting room, spent her days familiarizing herself with the massive estate, and dined with her husband only when social obligations demanded it. The Marquis remained as distant as the moon, disappearing to London on business for days at a time without explanation, and secluding himself in his study when present. Diana's life as Marchioness of Blackwood bore little resemblance to the marriage she had once imagined for herself. There were no shared confidences, no gentle touches, no companionship. Instead, she found herself mistress of a grand house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, populated by servants who watched her with curious, sometimes pitying eyes. Yet Diana refused to surrender to self-pity. If she could not have a true marriage, she would at least make herself useful. She began by learning the names of every servant, from the highest-ranking butler to the lowest scullery maid. She studied the household accounts, memorized the family histories of the tenant farmers, and explored every corner of the sprawling estate. Knowledge, she decided, was her best defense against feeling like an interloper. "My lady," Mrs. Winters approached her one morning in the conservatory, where Diana had been arranging flowers, "these tasks are hardly befitting your station. We have gardeners for cutting flowers." Diana continued her work, selecting a pale pink rose to complement the arrangement. "I find it soothing, Mrs. Winters. Besides, I have always believed that idleness breeds discontent." The housekeeper's lips thinned with disapproval. The previous Marchioness never concerned herself with such matters. The previous Marchioness? Diana paused, scissors in hand. "You mean the Marquis's mother?" "Indeed, Lady Eleanor Churchill," Mrs. Winters replied, her tone softening slightly. "A most refined lady. She understood the proper distance between the family and the staff." Diana set down her scissors, suddenly curious. In all the weeks she had been at Blackwood Manor, her husband had never once mentioned his mother. "Tell me about her, Mrs. Winters. What was she like?" The housekeeper hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "She was gentle, kind even. Perhaps too kind for her own good." Something flickered across her face, an old grief, quickly masked. "But it is not my place to speak of family matters, my lady." Before Diana could press further, a footman appeared at the conservatory entrance. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but the Marquis has returned from London and requests your presence in the drawing-room." Surprised by the unusual summons, Diana hastily removed her gardening apron and smoothed her hair. "Thank you, James. Please tell his lordship I shall be there directly." She found the Marquis standing by the window, still wearing his travelling clothes. He turned at her entrance, and Diana was struck by how weary he appeared. Dark shadows underscored his eyes, and there was a tightness to his mouth she had not seen before. "You wish to see me, my lord?" she said, curtsying slightly. "Yes." He gestured to a small rosewood table where a tea service had been laid. "Please sit. I have some matters to discuss." Diana obeyed, her curiosity piqued by this unprecedented invitation. In the 6 weeks of their marriage, they had never taken tea together, let alone engaged in private conversation beyond the most perfunctory exchanges. The Marquis remained standing, his posture rigid. "I have been informed that my cousin Lady Caroline Blackwell and her daughter intend to visit next week. They will stay for a fortnight." Diana nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite her surprise. "I shall ensure the guest rooms are prepared appropriately. There is more." He paced before the fireplace, his movements restless. "Lady Caroline was close to my father. After my mother's death, she frequently acted as his hostess for social gatherings." Something in his tone caught Diana's attention, a barely perceptible edge that suggested deep dislike. "I understand," she said carefully. "Would you prefer that I defer to her regarding household matters during her stay?" "No." His response was swift and emphatic. "You are the Marchioness of Blackwood now. This is your household to manage as you see fit." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Lady Caroline may attempt to assert her influence. She is accustomed to having her way at Blackwood Manor." Diana studied her husband's face, sensing there was much he was not saying. "And how would you prefer I handle such attempts?" For the first time, a flicker of something almost like approval crossed his features. "With the same spirit you have shown thus far, Lady Diana. My cousin respects strength, if little else." The conversation was interrupted by Harrison announcing that the Marquis's bath had been prepared. As her husband moved to leave, Diana found herself speaking without forethought. "My lord, I know very little of your family," she said. "If I am to navigate this visit successfully, perhaps you might enlighten me further." The Marquis paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment, Diana thought he would ignore her request. Then, without turning, he said, "My mother died when I was 12. A fever. Lady Caroline arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Churchill affairs ever since." His voice hardened. "She has a daughter, Miss Adelaide, who is near your age. They are our closest living relatives, but do not mistake that for affection." With those cryptic words he departed, leaving Diana with more questions than answers. That evening at dinner, another rare occasion when they dined together, Diana ventured to probe further. "Tell me about your mother, my lord. Mrs. Winters mentioned she was much beloved by the staff." The Marquis's knife stilled against his plate. "Did she?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "She seemed reluctant to elaborate," Diana admitted, "but I should like to know more about the lady whose place I now occupy." Her husband resumed cutting his meat with precise movements. "My mother was unlike anyone else in our circle," he finally said. "She came from a respectable family, but not one of great wealth or title. My father married her despite considerable opposition from his family." "For love?" Diana asked, unable to imagine the cold Marquis being the product of a love match. A shadow crossed his face. "So I was led to believe. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her spirit that captivated everyone who knew her. She treated servants with the same courtesy she showed to dukes. She insisted on personally supervising my education, rather than sending me away to school." His voice softened imperceptibly. "The gardens were her particular passion. The rose garden beyond the East Terrace was her creation." Diana recalled the neglected garden she had discovered during her explorations, once magnificent, but now overgrown and wild. "The one with the marble fountain." He nodded, something distant in his eyes. "She spent hours there, especially in summer." "Why has it been allowed to fall into disrepair?" Diana asked gently. The Marquis's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "After her death, my father ordered it abandoned. He had the gardeners focus their efforts elsewhere." His tone made it clear that the subject was closed. They finished the meal in silence, but as they rose from the table, the Marquis surprised her once more. "If you wished to restore the garden," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I would have no objection." Before Diana could respond, he bowed stiffly and left the room. The next morning, Diana sought out the head gardener, Mr. Hobbs, a weathered man with soil-ingrained hands and kind eyes. When she inquired about Lady Eleanor's rose garden, his face lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. "Oh, my lady, it was the jewel of Blackwood," he said, removing his cap. "Such roses you've never seen, varieties from all over the world. The old Marquis had them imported specially for her ladyship." "Why was it abandoned?" Diana asked, walking beside him toward the neglected garden. Hobbs's expression clouded. "Not my place to say, my lady, but it broke my heart to watch it go to ruin. The young master, the Marquis, that is, he used to help his mother tend the roses when he was a lad. Had a knack for it, he did." Diana tried to imagine her stern, reserved husband as a boy, helping his mother among the roses. The image seemed impossibly at odds with the man she knew. "Could it be restored, do you think?" she asked as they reached the garden's wrought-iron gate. "Aye, with time and care." Hobbs ran a loving hand over the rusted gate. "The bones are still good. Roses are hardy things. They survive more than you'd expect." "Then let us begin," Diana decided. "I want detailed plans by the end of the week, Mr. Hobbs. We'll start with clearing the overgrowth and assessing which plants can be saved." The old gardener's face broke into a broad smile. "It would be my greatest pleasure, my lady." Over the next several days, Diana threw herself into the garden restoration project. She consulted the estate's old planting records, studied books on horticulture from the library, and spent hours working alongside the gardeners, heedless of the dirt that stained her gowns or the sun that flushed her cheeks. The Marquis made no comment on her activities, though Diana occasionally glimpsed him watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Whether he approved or disapproved remained a mystery, but she continued nonetheless, finding unexpected satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos of tangled vines and neglected beds. It was during her third day of garden work that Diana discovered the small stone bench hidden beneath an overgrown arbor. As the gardeners cleared away the strangling vines, a name was revealed, carved into the seat. Eleanor. The Marquis had it made for her 15th birthday, a voice said behind her. Diana turned to find Mrs. Winters standing at the garden's edge, her usual stern expression softened by memory. "They were very close then?" Diana asked. The housekeeper nodded. "As close as mother and son could be. She was his shield against—" She stopped abruptly, seeming to remember herself. "Against the usual hardships of childhood, my lady." Diana sensed there was more to the story, much more, but she had learned that direct questions rarely yielded answers in this house of secrets. Instead, she brushed her soil-covered hands on her apron and said casually, "I should like to make this bench the centerpiece of the restored garden, Mrs. Winters, perhaps surrounded by white roses. They symbolize remembrance, I believe." Something like approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. Her ladyship was partial to white roses, as it happens. She called them her moonlight blossoms. For the first time since Diana's arrival, Mrs. Winters offered what might almost be called a smile. "The master was born on a full moon night," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Lady Eleanor always said it was why he was so stubborn. Touched by moon magic, she called it. The confidence, small as it was, felt like a victory. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Winters. I shall keep that in mind as we plan the garden's restoration." That evening, unable to sleep, Diana ventured to the library in search of a book. The vast room, lined with thousands of volumes collected over generations, was usually deserted at this hour. But as she pushed open the heavy door, she was startled to find her husband already there. The Marquis stood by a window, a small object cradled in his hands, his face illuminated only by moonlight. He had not heard her enter, and for a moment Diana observed him unguarded. Gone was the cold, impassive mask he wore like armor. In its place was an expression of such raw grief that Diana nearly gasped aloud. He was staring down at what appeared to be a miniature portrait, his fingers tracing its edges with a tenderness she had never witnessed from him. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot and the Marquis's head snapped up. His eyes widened at the sight of her, and he hastily slipped the portrait into his waistcoat pocket. "Forgive me," Diana said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude. It is of no consequence." His voice had resumed its usual detached tone, though Diana noticed his hands were not entirely steady. "You could not have known I would be here." An awkward silence stretched between them. Diana was acutely aware of her informal appearance, hair loosely braided for sleep, dressed only in her nightgown and dressing robe. The Marquis, by contrast, remained fully clothed, as though he had not yet retired, despite the late hour. "I came in search of a book," she explained, gesturing vaguely toward the shelves. "Something to help me sleep." "Try the east wall," he suggested, his composure fully restored. "Third shelf from the top." Tennyson's poems often induce slumber in even the most restless minds. The attempt at humor, however slight, surprised her. "You speak from experience, my lord." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." Diana moved toward the indicated shelf, feeling his eyes follow her. As she reached for the volume, her dressing gown slipped slightly, revealing a fading bruise on her forearm, a souvenir from her enthusiastic gardening efforts. "You're injured," the Marquis said sharply. Diana quickly adjusted her sleeve. "It's nothing. Merely an encounter with a particularly stubborn rosebush." He crossed to her side with unexpected swiftness, taking her arm with gentle fingers and pushing back the sleeve to examine the bruise. His touch, the first voluntary contact between them since their wedding day, sent an inexplicable warmth through her. "Roses have thorns for a reason," he he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. They are not meant to be tamed easily. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that had nothing to do with the minor injury, that made Diana's breath catch. "The most beautiful things often require the most care," she replied, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, his fingers on her skin, their faces close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, the Marquis released her arm and stepped back. "Good night, Lady Diana," he said, his voice once again formal. "I trust you will find Tennyson adequate company." He strode from the room without a backward glance, leaving Diana to wonder at the brief connection that had flared between them like a match struck in darkness. The next morning, Diana found a small package outside her door, a jar of salve wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note, but the gesture spoke volumes coming from a man who had declared she would never be his true wife. That same afternoon, as Diana supervised the clearing of a choked pathway in the rose garden, a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "So, this is where you've been hiding yourself," the Marquis said, surveying the transformation taking place. Where once had been wilderness, neat piles of cleared debris now stood alongside freshly turned earth and salvaged plants. Diana straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair from her perspiring forehead. "Hardly hiding, my lord. We've been making quite a racket, I'm afraid." "Indeed." His eyes moved over the garden, taking in the progress. "Mr. Hobbs informs me you've been working alongside the gardeners. Is that wise?" "Wiser than wasting my days on idle gossip and needlepoint, I should think," Diana replied with more spirit than she had intended. Then, softening her tone, she added, "Besides, I find the work satisfying. To see order emerging from chaos. There is a certain pleasure in that." The Marquis studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Lady Diana. Is that good or ill, my lord? I have yet to decide." He glanced toward the stone bench, now freed from its prison of vines and partially cleaned. "You found my mother's seat?" Diana nodded. "Mrs. Winters told me you had it made for her. For her 35th birthday," he corrected. "Not her 15th, as I suspect Mrs. Winters said. Our housekeeper's memory sometimes plays tricks on her these days." "It's a beautiful piece," Diana said. "I thought to make it the centerpiece of the garden, surrounded by white roses. Mrs. Winters mentioned they were your mother's favorite." The Marquis was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the carved name. "White roses were indeed her favorite," he finally said, "but she preferred them mingled with red ones. She said it made the white seem purer by contrast. This personal recollection freely offered felt like a gift." "Then we shall plant them as she preferred," Diana said softly. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, his gaze sharp upon her face. Diana considered her answer carefully. "Because something beautiful should not be left to ruin," she said at last. "Because your mother created this place with love, and such things deserve to be honored." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I have little else to occupy my days in a house where I am more ornament than wife." The last words slipped out unbidden, and Diana immediately regretted them. But instead of the cold rebuke she expected, the Marquis merely looked thoughtful. "My mother would have liked you, I think," he said, the words seeming to surprise even himself. Before Diana could respond, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon disappearing around the hedge. But the brief exchange had left her with a curious sense of hope, as if perhaps the first tiny crack had appeared in the wall between them. That evening, Diana retired early, exhausted from her day's exertions in the garden. As she sat before her dressing table, Martha brushing out her hair for the night, a knock sounded at the door to her sitting room. Martha went to answer it, returning moments later with a peculiar expression. "It's the Marquis, my lady," she whispered, eyes wide with surprise. "He asks if you would join him in the library when convenient." Diana's heart quickened. "Did he say why?" "No, my lady. Only that he has something to show you." Hastily donning a suitable evening dress, a simple blue silk that could be fastened without assistance, Diana made her way to the library, curious and slightly apprehensive. She found the Marquis standing before the fireplace, a leather-bound book in his hands. "Thank you for coming," he said, his usual formality softened by something that might almost be nervousness. "I thought you might find this of interest for your garden restoration project." He extended the book toward her. Diana took it carefully, opening the cover to reveal pages of delicate botanical illustrations, roses of every variety, painted in exquisite detail, with notes in a flowing feminine hand. "My mother's garden journal," the Marquis explained. "She documented every plant, its placement and care instructions. I thought it might be useful." Diana looked up from the precious volume, deeply moved by the gesture. "This is extraordinarily helpful, my lord. But are you certain you wish to entrust it to me? It must be very dear to you." "It is," he acknowledged, "but it was meant for a gardener's hands, not to gather dust in a drawer. My mother would have wanted it used." Diana ran her fingers gently over a particularly beautiful illustration of a climbing white rose. "She was talented." "She was," the Marquis agreed, and for the first time, Diana heard genuine warmth in his voice. "She taught herself botanical illustration. My father thought it a frivolous pursuit, but she persisted." Diana looked up sharply. "Your father disapproved of her interests?" Something dark flickered in the Marquis's eyes. "My father disapproved of many things that brought others joy." He turned away slightly, adding in a lower voice, "particularly things that brought her joy." The bitterness in his tone revealed volumes about the previous Marquis, and Diana began to understand something of the shadows that haunted her husband. Sensing that she had stumbled upon tender ground, she changed the subject. "Will you tell me about some of these varieties?" she asked, gesturing to the journal. "I confess I know little of roses beyond their beauty." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. To her surprise, the Marquis settled into a chair beside hers and began turning pages, pointing out particular specimens and recounting their origins. For over an hour they sat thus, heads bent together over the journal, their conversation flowing more naturally than ever before. It was only when the clock chimed 11 that the Marquis seemed to remember himself. "I've kept you too long," he said, rising abruptly. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Diana assured him, reluctant to break the spell of companionship that had briefly existed between them. "I have enjoyed our conversation immensely." He regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "As have I," he admitted, as if the realization surprised him. Perhaps we might continue it another evening." "I would like that very much," Diana said softly. For a moment longer, he stood looking at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Then he bowed formally and bid her good night. As Diana returned to her chambers, the precious garden journal clutched to her chest, she felt a cautious optimism stirring within her. The wall between them had not fallen, but tonight had revealed that it might not be as impenetrable as she had feared. 3 days later, however, any progress made was threatened by the arrival of Lady Caroline Blackwell and her daughter, Adelaide. From the moment they swept into Blackwood Manor in a flurry of silk and demands, Diana understood her husband's warning. Lady Caroline, a striking woman in her 40s with shrewd eyes and a practiced smile, immediately began inspecting the house with the air of one checking that her possessions had been properly maintained in her absence. "The drawing-room draperies are showing wear, George," she announced at dinner their first evening. "You really must have new ones commissioned. I saw the most divine fabric at Whitley's in London. I'd be happy to order it for you." The Marquis's expression remained neutral. "I believe such matters now fall under my wife's purview, Caroline." Lady Caroline's gaze swung to Diana, assessing her with barely concealed disdain. "Of course. How forgetful of me." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though perhaps Diana would appreciate my guidance being so new to her role. It can be quite overwhelming to manage a house of this stature, especially for someone not raised in our circles." The barb was thinly veiled, and Diana felt her cheeks warm. But before she could respond, the Marquis spoke. "My wife has been managing admirably," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Blackwood has never been in better hands." The unexpected defense left Diana momentarily speechless. Lady Caroline's smile tightened, but she merely inclined her head in acknowledgement before turning her attention to her daughter. Adelaide Blackwell was a pretty young woman of perhaps 20, with her mother's dark colouring but none of her sharp edges. Throughout dinner she sat silently, occasionally casting nervous glances at the Marquis when she thought no one was looking. After the meal, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Lady Caroline wasted no time in establishing her dominance. "You must find Blackwood quite provincial after London," she remarked, settling onto a sofa as though it were a throne. "Of course, you haven't been presented at court yet, have you?" Such a pity your marriage was so hastily arranged." "I find Blackwood fascinating," Diana replied evenly, "and I've never been particularly drawn to London society." Lady Caroline laughed, a brittle sound. "How charmingly rustic. But surely you must feel the isolation. George is hardly known for his sociability. Adelaide and I used to despair of drawing him out even when he was a boy. So serious, always with his nose in a book or trailing after his mother in that garden of hers." She sighed dramatically. "Poor Eleanor. She never quite fit in, you know." "From what I've heard, she was much beloved," Diana said carefully, noting how Adelaide tensed at the mention of the former Marchioness. "Oh, by the servants, certainly," Lady Caroline conceded with a dismissive wave. "She had a way with them. But in society, I'm afraid she was rather out of her depth. My cousin, the late Marquis, made a terrible mistake in marrying so far beneath him." Her eyes glittered as she examined Diana. A mistake George seems determined to repeat. The insult hung in the air between them. Diana felt her pulse quicken with anger, but years of training in proper behavior kept her expression composed. "How fortunate, then, that the choice was his to make," she replied, with deceptive mildness. "Just as the management of this household is now mine." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Speaking of which, I must speak with Mrs. Winters about tomorrow's menus. If you'll excuse me." She departed before Lady Caroline could respond, her heart pounding. Only when she was safely in the corridor did Diana allow herself a small, grim smile. The battle lines had been drawn. Later that night, as Martha prepared her for bed, Diana's thoughts remained troubled. She despised his mother, she mused aloud. I wonder why? Martha, ever discreet, hesitated before responding. "There are whispers below stairs, my lady. The servants who have been here longest say that Lady Caroline had hoped to marry the old Marquis herself, before he chose Lady Eleanor instead." Diana's eyebrows rose. "And she's harboured that resentment all these years." "Some wounds fester rather than heal," Martha said wisely, "especially those to pride." Diana thought of the garden journal, of the woman who had lovingly documented each rose. What had it been like for gentle Eleanor Churchill to live under the same roof as a woman who resented her very existence? "There's more," Martha added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say that after Lady Eleanor died, Lady Caroline was quick to console the old Marquis, very quick indeed. Within months she was acting as mistress of Blackwood, in all but name." Diana recalled her husband's cold voice. Lady Caroline arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Churchill affairs ever since. The pieces were beginning to fit together, painting a picture of a household divided by grief, resentment, and perhaps something darker. "And the Marquis, my husband, what was his relationship with Lady Caroline?" Martha's expression grew troubled. "I cannot say for certain, my lady. But the older servants hint that the young master suffered greatly after his mother's death, and not just from grief." A chill ran through Diana as she considered the implications. What kind of childhood had her husband endured in this grand cold house? What secrets lay buried beneath the polished floors of Blackwood Manor? As she lay awake that night, Diana's thoughts turned to the man sleeping in another wing of the house, a man who had declared she would never be his true wife, yet who had defended her against Lady Caroline's barbs, who had shared his mother's precious garden journal, who had perhaps begun to see her as something more than a convenient solution to a dynastic problem. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would continue her work in the garden, not just for the sake of honouring Eleanor Churchill's memory, but because somehow she sensed that in restoring what had been broken, she might find a way to reach the man whose heart had been similarly neglected. The fortnight of Lady Caroline's visit stretched Diana's patience to its limits, but she emerged victorious in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new attempts by the older woman to undermine Diana's authority in the household, yet with each challenge, the Marquis sided firmly with his wife. By the time the visitors departed, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor, a subtle rebalancing of power that left Diana feeling more secure in her position than ever before. More importantly, the shared adversary had forged an unexpected alliance between Diana and her husband. The Marquis began joining her for breakfast, a meal they had never before shared. Their conversations, once stilted and formal, now flowed more easily, particularly when discussing the garden restoration, which had become Diana's passion. As summer faded into autumn, Bringing cooler winds and shorter days, the garden began to take shape. The wild tangle had been cleared away, revealing the original pathways and beds. Many of the roses had proved remarkably resilient, sending up new shoots once freed from the choking weeds. With the guidance of Lady Eleanor's journal, Diana and Mr. Hobbs had created a planting scheme that honored the original design while adding complementary new varieties. The Marquis took to walking the grounds each evening, his path invariably leading him to the rose garden where Diana often worked until dusk. He would observe her progress, sometimes offering memories of how the garden had looked in his mother's time. Occasionally, he would even roll up his sleeves and assist with a particularly stubborn root or help position a new trellis. During these shared moments, Diana caught glimpses of the man beneath the formal exterior, a man with unexpected gentleness in his hands and memories of happiness not entirely extinguished by grief. She began to understand that the cold, distant Marquis, who had declared she would never be his true wife, was a fortress built around a heart that had known too much pain. On a crisp October evening, as the last rays of sunlight gilded the turning leaves, Diana was supervising the installation of a small fountain near her mother-in-law's bench when the Marquis appeared at the garden entrance. His face was unusually grave, and he carried a letter in his hand. "My lord," Diana greeted him, setting down her gardening gloves. "Is something amiss?" "I've had word from London," he said, his voice tight. "There has been an outbreak of influenza in the city. Several prominent families have been affected." Diana's heart sank. Influenza was a dreaded visitor, capable of sweeping through entire households with devastating consequences. "Should we be concerned here at Blackwood?" "Perhaps." He folded the letter carefully. "I must travel to London tomorrow. My solicitor has fallen ill, and there are urgent matters that cannot wait." "Surely they can wait until the outbreak subsides," Diana protested. "It's not worth risking your health." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. "The affairs of an estate this size do not pause for illness, Lady Diana. I will take precautions." Diana wanted to argue further, but knew it would be futile. Instead, she nodded, trying to mask her worry. "How long will you be gone?" "No more than 3 days," he assured her. "I shall return before the week's end." That night, as Diana prepared for bed, she found herself unusually restless. The thought of the Marquis exposing himself to the dangers of an influenza outbreak troubled her more deeply than she cared to admit. When had her feelings toward him shifted from wary curiosity to genuine concern? She could not pinpoint the moment, but she knew with certainty that the prospect of harm coming to him now caused her genuine distress. "You're fond of him," Martha observed quietly as she brushed Diana's hair. Diana met her maid's eyes in the mirror. "Is that so surprising?" "Not to me, my lady," Martha said with a small smile. "He's changed these past months. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Has he?" Diana murmured, more to herself than to Martha. "Or have I simply learned to see him more clearly?" "Perhaps both," Martha suggested wisely. The Marquis departed early the next morning, before Diana had risen. She found a brief note on her breakfast tray, written in his precise hand. "Lady Diana, I shall return by Friday. The garden journal remains in your capable hands. G." Those 3 days stretched longer than any Diana had experienced at Blackwood. She filled them with activity, supervising the garden work, reviewing household accounts, and writing long overdue letters to old friends. Yet her thoughts continually drifted to London and the man who had gone there despite the danger. On Friday morning, Diana woke with a sense of anticipation. She took extra care with her appearance, selecting a deep blue dress that Martha had once mentioned brought out the color in her eyes. When the Marquis had not arrived by dinner time, she told herself there had likely been delays on the road. Nothing to worry about. It was nearly midnight when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the clatter of carriage wheels, the hurried footsteps of servants, and Harrison's voice raised in alarm. Diana threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried downstairs, propriety forgotten in her concern. She found chaos in the main hall. The Marquis had indeed returned, but he was being supported between 2 footmen, his face alarmingly flushed, his normally immaculate appearance dishevelled. "My lord!" Diana rushed forward as the men helped him to a chair. The Marquis looked up at her through fever-glazed eyes. "Diana," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Forgive me. Did not wish to—" Disturb you?" Diana pressed her palm to his forehead and gasped at the heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning with fever." "Harrison, send for Dr. Thompson immediately, and have a fire lit in the Marquis's chamber." "Already seen to, my lady," Harrison assured her, his usual stoic demeanor betraying concern. "James has gone for the doctor." "Help me get him upstairs," Diana instructed, her fear giving way to decisive action. "He needs to be in bed at once." Between the footman and Diana's support, they managed to get the Marquis to his bedchamber. His valet Stevens was already turning down the bed and stoking the fire. With efficient movements born of long service, he began removing the Marquis's travel-soiled clothing. "I shall wait outside," Diana said, moving toward the door to give her husband privacy. "No." The Marquis's fevered gaze found hers, unexpectedly lucid for a moment. "Stay, please." She nodded, turning her back while Stevens completed his task and helped the Marquis into a nightshirt. When he was settled in bed, Diana approached again, taking the chair that Stevens placed beside it. "What happened?" she asked gently, taking his hand. It was hot and dry in hers, the skin papery with fever. The Marquis closed his eyes briefly. "Solicitor's household, all ill. Should have been more careful." A violent shiver racked his frame. Cold. So cold. Diana pulled the coverlet higher around his shoulders. "The doctor will be here soon," she assured him, though her heart raced with fear. She had seen influenza claim lives before, healthy young lives snuffed out in days. Dr. Thompson arrived within the hour, his lined face grave as he examined the Marquis. Diana waited anxiously in the adjoining sitting room, pacing before the fire until the doctor emerged. "Influenza, as I suspect you already guessed," he confirmed, closing his medical bag. "A severe case, I'm afraid. The next 48 hours will be critical." "What can be done?" Diana asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Keep him cool to combat the fever. Ensure he drinks water, broth if he can manage it. I've left laudanum for the pain and to help him sleep." The elderly physician hesitated, his kind eyes troubled. "My lady, I must warn you, the servants may be reluctant to attend him closely. There is always fear when sickness of this nature strikes a household." "I understand, Doctor," Diana said, squaring her shoulders. "Thank you for your candor." After Dr. Thompson departed, Diana called Mrs. Winters and Harrison to the drawing room. "The Marquis is gravely ill," she informed them, her voice calm despite her inner turmoil. "I will need a rotation of staff to assist in his care." Mrs. Winters and Harrison exchanged uncomfortable glances. "My lady," the housekeeper began, her normally austere face betraying unease. "The staff is concerned about contagion. The last time influenza swept through the house during the old Marquis's time, 3 servants died." Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "I see." She considered for a moment, then made her decision. "Then I shall tend to him myself." "My lady," Mrs. Winters gasped, scandalized. "That is hardly appropriate. Perhaps we could send for a nurse from the village." "There is no time," Diana said firmly. "And I will not have it said that the Marchioness of Blackwood abandoned her husband in his hour of need." She looked from one stunned face to the other. "I will require fresh water, clean linens, and broth to be brought at regular intervals. Beyond that, I will manage." "Yes, my lady," Harrison said, a new respect evident in his voice. As night fell, Diana took her place at the Marquis's bedside. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, his powerful frame now racked with fever and chills. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't understand. Diana dipped a cloth in cool water and gently bathed his face and neck. His skin burned beneath her fingers, his breathing labored. She had discarded her shawl hours ago, her hair falling loose down her back as she worked tirelessly to bring his temperature down. "You must fight this, George," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "You are too stubborn to let a mere fever defeat you." Throughout the long night, she tended him without rest, changing the cool compresses, coaxing sips of water between his parched lips, administering the laudanum when pain twisted his features. When his nightshirt became soaked with sweat, she changed it herself, her hands steady despite the intimacy of the task. It was near dawn during the darkest hour of the night when the Marquis's fever reached its peak. He thrashed against the bedclothes, calling out in distress. "Eleanor," he moaned. "Mother, Don't leave me." Diana's heart clenched at the raw anguish in his voice. She took his hand between both of hers. "Shh, you're not alone," she soothed, stroking his brow. "I'm here with you, George. I'm here." His eyes opened, glazed with fever, not truly seeing her. "She's gone," he whispered brokenly. "He said it was my fault. My fault she died." "No," Diana said firmly, though she knew he was lost in delirium. "It was never your fault, George. Never." He gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Catherine," he murmured, a name Diana didn't recognize. "I'm sorry. Couldn't save you." Diana continued to hold his hand as his words dissolved into restless sleep once more. Who was Catherine? Another piece of the puzzle that was her husband, a name connected to pain and regret. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, the Marquis's fever finally broke. Diana, exhausted beyond measure, laid her head on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand, and fell into an uneasy sleep. She woke to the sensation of fingers gently stroking her hair. Opening her eyes, she found the Marquis awake, his gaze clear for the first time in hours, fixed upon her face. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse from the long night's ordeal. Diana sat up, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. Her hair loose, her dress wrinkled, dark shadows under her eyes. "Of course I stayed. The servants wouldn't come near," he said. "It wasn't a question. They were afraid. But you weren't." His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I was," she admitted quietly. "Not of the fever, but of losing you." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something shifting in his expression, a softening, a recognition. "You changed my nightshirt," he said after a moment, a hint of his old reserve returning. Diana felt heat rise to her cheeks. It needed to be done. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You continue to surprise me, Diana Russell." "Churchill," she corrected softly. "Diana Churchill." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something new and unnamed passing between them. Then, "Yes," he said quietly, "my wife." It wasn't a declaration of love, not even close. But in those two simple words, "my wife," spoken without the usual distance, Diana heard the first chime of a bell that had been silent for too long. As she rose to fetch fresh water, his hand caught hers once more. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. Diana nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Something had changed during that long night of vigil, something fundamental and irrevocable. In his moment of greatest vulnerability, the Marquis of Blackwood had revealed more of himself than in all the months of their marriage. And Diana, witnessing his pain and fear, had found something in her heart she hadn't expected. Not just duty or obligation, but a genuine desire to ease his suffering. As she slipped from the room to order fresh broth and linens, Diana realized with a start that she no longer viewed her marriage solely as an arrangement of convenience. Somewhere in the quiet hours of tending to a man lost in fever dreams, she had begun to care for her husband, perhaps even to love him. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The Marquis's recovery was slow but steady. For a week, he remained confined to his bed, his usually formidable strength sapped by the fever. During this time, Diana continued to oversee his care, spending hours reading to him, discussing estate matters, or simply sitting in companionable silence as he dozed. These quiet days of convalescence revealed aspects of George Churchill that Diana might never have discovered otherwise. His dry wit, his extensive knowledge of literature, his thoughtful opinions on everything from agricultural techniques to political reform. Without the pressures of formal society or the weight of managing the estate, he seemed lighter somehow, more inclined to conversation and even occasional laughter. For his part, the Marquis observed his wife with new eyes. The woman who had nursed him through the fever was not the proper, somewhat reserved Lady Diana he had married, but a determined, compassionate force of nature who had faced down fear to care for him when others would not. "You risked your own health," he remarked one afternoon as they sat before the fire in his sitting room, Diana reading aloud from a volume of Scott's poetry. "Why?" Diana closed the book, marking her place with a ribbon. "Would you have had me abandon you to the care of frightened servants? or a hired nurse who saw you only as a duty. Most wives of our circle would have done precisely that, he pointed out. It would have been perfectly acceptable. I am not most wives, Diana replied simply, and I did not marry you to be acceptable, but to be your wife, in name at least, if nothing more. Something flickered in his eyes at her words. And if I wished for more than a wife in name only? Diana's heart quickened. Then you would need to tell me what that means, my lord, for you once made it very clear that I would never be your true wife. The Marquis winced slightly at the reminder of his cold declaration. I was not at my best when we met, he admitted. I had convinced myself that a marriage of convenience was all I required, all I deserved, perhaps. And now? Diana asked softly. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. Now I find myself wondering what might be possible between two people who began as strangers, but have perhaps become something more. Diana felt a rush of emotion too complex to name. I would like to discover that as well, she said, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment they sat in silence, hands joined, the fire crackling in the grate. Then the Marquis, George, spoke again. There are things you should know about me, Diana, things I have never shared with anyone. His face was solemn, his eyes shadowed. About my mother's death, about Catherine. Diana squeezed his hand gently. There will be time for all of that, she assured him, when you are stronger. He nodded, grateful for the reprieve, yet somehow lighter for having expressed the intention. Will you read a little more? He asked. Your voice, it brings me peace. Diana opened the book again, resuming where she had left off, her heart full of tentative hope. The road ahead might not be smooth. There were clearly wounds in her husband's past that had not yet healed, secrets that still haunted him. But for the first time she believed they might travel it together. As she read the poet's words of love and longing, she felt George's gaze upon her face, no longer distant or guarded, but warm with something that might, in time, grow into affection, perhaps even love. From the hallway outside, Mrs. Winters observed the scene through the partially open door, the Marquis and his bride, hands clasped, faces illuminated by firelight, a tableau of quiet intimacy that reminded the old housekeeper of another couple long ago. Lady Eleanor would approve, she murmured to herself as she moved away, a rare smile softening her stern features. Her son has found his way home at last. November arrived with bitter winds and early frosts, but within Blackwood Manor, a different sort of change was taking place. The weeks following the Marquis's illness had brought a gradual but unmistakable shift in his relationship with Diana. They now took most meals together, spent evenings in the library sharing books and conversation, and walked the grounds arm in arm when weather permitted. Though they still maintained separate bedchambers, a fact that occasionally caused Diana moments of wistful contemplation, in most other respects they had begun to forge a true partnership. Yet despite this new closeness, Diana sensed her husband still held part of himself in reserve. The name he had spoken during his fever, Catherine, had not been mentioned again, though it lingered in Diana's thoughts. Who was this woman whose memory caused him such pain? Another piece of the puzzle that was George Churchill, waiting to be revealed. Her opportunity came on a dreary afternoon when rain lashed the windows of Blackwood Manor, confining them indoors. Diana was arranging dried flowers from the garden in a porcelain vase when George entered the drawing room, a hesitant expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, coming to stand beside her, "about what I said during my recovery, that there were things you should know about me." Diana's fingers stilled among the rose hips and dried lavender. "Yes? If we are truly to build something between us, you deserve to know the truth." He gestured to the sofa. "Would you sit with me? It's not a brief tale." Diana joined him, her heart quickening at his serious tone. For a long moment, George stared into the fire as if gathering his thoughts, or his courage. "I told you my mother died when I was 12, he began finally. "What I didn't explain was that after her death my father changed, or perhaps, as you once suggested, he simply revealed his true nature without her moderating influence." He drew a deep breath, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "He became cruel, particularly to me. He blamed me for her death. She fell ill after nursing me through a similar fever, and he made certain I knew it." George's voice remained steady, but Diana saw the tension in his clasped hands. Lady Caroline encouraged his bitterness. She had always resented my mother, and now she had her opportunity to erase Eleanor Churchill's memory from Blackwood. "That's why the garden was abandoned," Diana said softly. "Yes, it was the first thing to go. Then her portraits were moved to storage, her rooms redecorated, her name rarely spoken. A muscle worked in his jaw. I was sent away to school shortly after, not Eton, where my friends were, but a remote, austere institution in Scotland, known for its harsh discipline. My father claimed it would make a man of me." Diana's heart ached at the thought of a grieving boy, sent away from everything familiar, shouldering an undeserved burden of guilt. "How long were you there?" 6 years. I was permitted home only briefly in summers, and by then Lady Caroline was effectively mistress of Blackwood, though my father never actually married her. His voice hardened. She had hoped he would, of course. That was always her ambition, to be Marchioness of Blackwood, but my father was too shrewd to grant her the legal status she craved. "And Adelaide? Her daughter?" A shadow crossed George's face. "Adelaide came to Blackwood when she was 10, a quiet, frightened girl. My father treated her with a kindness he never showed me, which Lady Caroline was quick to interpret as evidence that he might adopt Adelaide as his ward, perhaps even make her his heir if I continued to disappoint him." Diana's eyes widened. Could he have done such a thing? Set aside his own son and heir? Not legally, no, but he could have made my position extremely difficult had he chosen to. George's expression softened slightly. Adelaide herself was an innocent in her mother's schemes. We developed something of an understanding over the years, both of us pawns in games played by others. "What happened when you came of age?" Diana asked gently. "I went to university, then travelled abroad for several years. It was easier than returning to Blackwood." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I discovered I had some aptitude for business and investment. By 25 I had built my own modest fortune, independent of my inheritance. I thought perhaps I had finally escaped my father's shadow." His expression darkened again. "Then I met Catherine Hallowell." Diana's breath caught. Here at last was the mysterious Catherine, the name he had called out in his fevered state. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, beautiful, intelligent, full of life. For the first time, George's voice wavered slightly. "We met at a musical in London. She played the pianoforte brilliantly and laughed at my poor attempts at humour. Within a month I had asked for her hand and her father had consented." "You were engaged," Diana said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. George nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. "For 6 months. The happiest of my life. My father was furious, of course. The daughter of a merchant was hardly the match he had envisioned for the future Marquis of Blackwood. He refused to attend the wedding, threatened to cut me off entirely. But you didn't care," Diana guessed. "I would have married her if she hadn't had a penny to her name," he confirmed. "We had plans. A house in London, travels to Italy, a life built on our own terms." Diana already knew this story would not end happily, yet her heart contracted at the pain evident in his face. "What happened?" "Influenza," George said simply, the single word laden with grief. 3 weeks before our wedding. I was in Edinburgh on business. By the time I received word and returned to London, she was gone." He closed his eyes briefly. "I never even had the chance to say goodbye." "Oh, George," Diana whispered, taking his hand in hers. "I'm so sorry." He turned his hand to clasp hers, drawing strength from her touch. "My father called it divine judgment, punishment for my defiance in choosing a bride he hadn't approved. Lady Caroline suggested it was Catherine's common blood that made her too weak to fight the illness." Diana's indignation flared. "How dare they? To use such a tragedy to wound you further." "It hardly mattered by then," George interrupted, his voice hollow. "I was already devastated beyond their reach. I retreated to my London house, saw no one for months. When my father died suddenly the following year, I returned to Blackwood only out of duty." He looked around the room, his expression distant. "I became Marquis of Blackwood at 28, master of an estate I had grown to hate, with a title that had brought me nothing but pain. I closed off the east wing where my mother's rooms had been, dismissed half the staff who remembered her, and dedicated myself to business matters, rarely spending more than a few weeks here at a time." "And Lady Caroline?" Diana asked. "She expected to remain at Blackwood, of course." "One of my first acts as Marquis was to settle a modest income on her and Adelaide, and establish them in a house in Bath. A hint of grim satisfaction crossed his face. She has never forgiven me for thwarting her ambitions. Diana thought of the woman's barely concealed hostility during her visit, and understood it in a new light. And for 8 years, you lived thus? Alone? Dividing your time between London and an estate you could not love? Yes, George acknowledged. Until my solicitor suggested it was time I married and secured the succession. A business arrangement, he called it, a suitable wife from a good family who would provide heirs and manage the social obligations I had neglected. He looked at Diana directly now. I agreed because it seemed the sensible course. I had convinced myself I was incapable of loving again. So why not treat marriage as I did my other affairs, practically without sentiment? Diana felt a chill at his words, remembering their first meeting and his cold declaration that she would never be his true wife. And then I arrived, she said quietly. Yes, George's expression softened. You arrived, with your quiet dignity and your unexpected spirit. You who faced Lady Caroline without flinching. You who brought my mother's garden back to life. His voice dropped lower. You who stayed when everyone else fled from my sickness. Diana's heart quickened at the warmth in his gaze. I couldn't leave you, she said simply. I know that now. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. And that is why I needed to tell you about Catherine, because her memory has stood between us from the beginning. My guilt at failing her, my fear of experiencing such loss again. You haven't failed her, Diana said firmly. Illness claimed her, just as it nearly claimed you. Neither was your fault. Perhaps, George conceded. But for years I've held myself responsible, for not being there when she needed me, for not protecting her as I had promised. And now? Diana asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Now I find myself facing a different sort of guilt. He reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. The guilt of realizing I have begun to care deeply for a woman who is in fact my wife, when I had vowed never to open my heart again. Diana leaned slightly into his touch, her pulse racing. That is not something worthy of guilt, George. Isn't it? His eyes searched hers. I told you that you would never be my true wife. I entered our marriage determined to keep you at arm's length. I denied us both the chance for happiness out of fear and old wounds. The past cannot be undone, Diana said gently, but the future is ours to shape, together if you wish it. For answer, George drew her closer, one hand cradling her face. I do wish it, he murmured, more than I believed possible. When his lips met hers, Diana felt as though some final barrier between them had dissolved. This was not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but a true meeting of hearts, tender, reverent, and filled with promise. As they drew apart, George kept her hand in his. There is something else I've been meaning to show you, he said, his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. Will you come with me? Curious, Diana allowed him to lead her from the drawing room, up the grand staircase and down a corridor in the east wing she had never explored. They stopped before a set of double doors, which George unlocked with a key from his waistcoat pocket. These were my mother's private rooms, he explained as he pushed open the doors. I closed them after inheriting the title. No one has entered in 8 years. Diana stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. George moved to draw back the heavy curtains, allowing weak afternoon light to filter into a spacious sitting room. Dust cloths covered the furniture, and the air held the stillness of long disuse. Yet there was something welcoming about the space nonetheless. It's beautiful, Diana said, taking in the elegant proportions of the room, the delicate mouldings on the ceiling, the tall windows overlooking what had been Eleanor's rose garden. These should have been your rooms from the beginning, George said, watching her face. As Marchioness, they are rightfully yours. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone occupying them after her, but now, he hesitated, now I think my mother would want you to make them your own. Diana turned to him, deeply moved by the gesture. Are you certain? Completely. He took both her hands in his. Diana, I have spent too many years allowing grief to dictate my life. It's time to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. His eyes held hers steadily. Just as my mother's garden is blooming again under your care, perhaps Blackwood itself can become a true home once more. I would like that, Diana said softly. Very much. There's something else, George added, his manner suddenly less certain. Something I've been considering since my recovery. Yes? Diana prompted when he hesitated. Our current arrangement, separate rooms, separate lives in many ways, it was what I wanted when we married. He drew a deep breath. It is not what I want now. Diana's heart began to race. What are you saying, George? I'm asking if you would consider, if you might wish to... He shook his head, seemingly frustrated with his own awkwardness. Diana, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife in truth, not merely in name? The question hung in the air between them, momentous and yet so simple. Diana looked at the man before her, no longer the cold, distant Marquis who had once declared she would never be his true wife, but a man who had shown her his wounded heart and was now offering it into her keeping. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. I would be honored to be your true wife, George. The smile that transformed his face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He drew her into his arms, holding her as though she were infinitely precious. I cannot promise you a perfect happiness, he said against her hair. I have been too long in darkness to find the light easily. I don't ask for perfection, Diana replied, echoing words she had spoken to him during his illness. Only for honesty, and the chance to build something real between us. Their lips met again, the kiss deeper now, filled with newfound hope and possibilities neither had dared imagine when they had first met in his study all those months ago. Outside, the rain had stopped, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast a golden glow over Eleanor Churchill's newly restored garden. Inside, two people who had come together through duty were discovering something far more precious, a love born of compassion, strengthened through adversity, and now ready to flourish in the light of truth. In the months that followed, Blackwood Manor underwent a transformation as remarkable as that of its master and mistress. Diana moved into Eleanor's rooms, which were redecorated with her own taste, while preserving elements of their original character. The east wing, long closed off, became once again a center of life and activity. George found himself rediscovering his childhood home through Diana's eyes, seeing beauty where he had only remembered pain, finding comfort in traditions he had long abandoned. Together they began visiting the tenant farms, inspecting cottages that needed repair, establishing a school for the estate children. Diana's practical nature complemented his business acumen, creating improvements that benefited everyone who called Blackwood home. As winter settled over the countryside, blanketing the restored rose garden in snow, they established new traditions of their own, evenings by the fire in the library, reading to each other from favorite books, Sunday visits to the village church, where George had not set foot since inheriting the title. Christmas decorations more lavish than Blackwood had seen in a decade, culminating in a feast for the tenants in the great hall. And at night, in the privacy of what was now their shared bedchamber, they discovered each other anew, not as the strangers who had wed out of duty and convenience, but as partners who had chosen each other freely, with full knowledge of the other's strengths and frailties. It was in such a moment, as they lay entwined in the darkness, that Diana finally found courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since learning of Catherine. "Do you still think of her?" she asked softly, her head resting on George's chest. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Sometimes," he admitted, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "Not with the sharp grief of before, but with a kind of gratitude. She taught me I was capable of love when I had begun to doubt it. I wish I could have known her," Diana said sincerely. "She would have liked you." George pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But it is you, Diana Churchill, who has brought me back to life. You who has made Blackwood a home again." Diana smiled in the darkness. "We have done it together." "Yes," he agreed, drawing her closer. "And we have a lifetime ahead to continue the work." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of winter wind. Diana was nearly asleep when George spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I had convinced myself that love was a weakness, that it made one vulnerable to unbearable loss." His arms tightened around her. "I was wrong. Love is the greatest strength we possess. It takes more courage to open one's heart than to keep it locked away." Diana raised herself on one elbow to look down at her husband's face, silver in the moonlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. "When did you become so wise, my lord?" she asked, only half teasing. George smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek. "When I had the good sense to marry a woman wiser than myself," he replied, though I was too stubborn to recognize it at first. Diana laughed softly, settling back into his embrace. "We have both learned much since that first meeting in your study." "Indeed," George agreed, "though there is one thing I knew even then, despite my best efforts to deny it." "And what was that?" "That you were extraordinary, Diana Russell." He kissed her with tender reverence. "And that I was fortunate beyond measure that you had agreed to become Diana Churchill." Outside, snow continued to fall, mantling Blackwood Manor in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, the Marquis and Marchioness of Blackwood drifted to sleep, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had become something far more rare and precious. A true meeting of hearts, bound by a love that had overcome pride, pain, and the shadows of the past to find its way into the light. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the gardens of Blackwood Manor as Diana watched from the terrace. 4-year-old Eleanor Catherine Churchill, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit, led her younger brother James on a merry chase among the rose bushes. "Careful, Ellie," Diana called. "Your brother cannot run as quickly as you." The little girl slowed obligingly, turning to take her toddling brother's hand with surprising gentleness. "Come on, Jamie," she said. "I'll show you the frog pond." Diana smiled, one hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly where their third child grew. The doctors were confident this pregnancy would be as healthy as her previous two, but George still insisted she rest frequently. As if summoned by her thoughts, her husband appeared at her side, placing a protective arm around her waist. "Our daughter has her mother's kind heart," he observed, watching the children. "And her father's leadership abilities," Diana added with a smile. "No one refuses Ellie anything when she sets her mind to it." George chuckled, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar over the years. "Heaven help us when she comes of age. The ton won't know what hit them." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children explore the world they had created together. A world built on trust, respect, and deep, abiding love. "Do you ever think about that day when we first met?" Diana asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How different things might have been if we had continued as we began." George pressed a kiss to her temple. "I try not to dwell on what might have been, but I thank Providence every day that you were brave enough to see beyond my walls, stubborn enough to remain when I pushed you away, and loving enough to show me what it meant to truly live again." Diana turned in his arms to face him. "It wasn't bravery," she said softly. "It was love, perhaps even before I recognized it myself." "Then I am the most fortunate of men," he said, "to have been loved so well." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Blackwood Manor, Diana reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a cold business arrangement to a marriage of true hearts. The path had not always been smooth, but each challenge had only strengthened the bond between them. The man who had once declared she would never be his true wife now looked at her as though she were his entire world. And in his eyes, Diana saw the reflection of her own heart, complete, cherished, and utterly at home. "Come," George said, offering his arm. "Let's join our children. James has been asking all morning to show you his collection of interesting stones." Diana took his arm, smiling up at the man she had come to know and love so deeply. "Lead the way, my love. Lead the way." And together they walked into the sunshine, toward the future they had built with patience, courage, and the transformative power of love. The end. Dear listener, tonight's story reminded us that even in a marriage built on cold agreements and silent halls, love can bloom quietly, one gesture, one moment of care at a time. Maybe you too have felt that some doors in life were closed for good, that it was too late to begin again, to trust, to soften. But this tale gently whispers what life itself tries to show us. The heart does not age in its capacity to feel, to heal, to love. You who have walked through so many seasons, who have known loss, sacrifice, and perhaps long silences, you carry within you the quiet strength of Diana, who chose kindness when she was met with coldness. And maybe, like the Marquis, you carry wounds you've never spoken aloud. That's okay. What matters is that healing is still possible. Connection is still possible. Love in all its forms is still possible. Let that truth rest on your heart tonight like a warm blanket. May you sleep knowing that you are not forgotten, not alone, not too late for beauty or tenderness. There is still light ahead. There is still warmth waiting for you. May peace surround your dreams, and may tomorrow greet you with quiet hope. With heartfelt gratitude, from all of us at Legends of the Fall, thank you for staying with us until the very end. We hope this story embraced your heart the way it did ours. If it brought you peace, emotion, or even a quiet tear, consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, sharing it with someone dear, and leaving us a heartfelt comment. From the depths of our hearts, thank you for supporting Legends of the Fall. Your presence gives us strength to keep telling these stories, full of love, second chances, and redemption. At the end of this video, you'll see another beautiful story suggestion from our channel. Click and let yourself be moved again.